Think you know how Rome fell? The truth is far stranger and more gradual than you might imagine. For over a century, the mightiest empire the world had ever seen slowly transformed into something completely different, not through a single catastrophic collapse, but through countless small changes that added up to revolutionary transformation. Barbarian kings who spoke Latin and ruled like emperors, Gothic warriors who defended Roman law, and a final emperor who was just a frightened child, all played their parts in this incredible story. We'll explore this fascinating transformation in more depth in this video and learn how the fall of Rome was really more like a metamorphosis that created the medieval world. If you like these videos, I would appreciate if you clicked like or subscribed, as it's important for the channel and it helps others find it too, just like you did. Thank you. Now, let's get started. Picture this, if you will, a moment when the ancient world held its breath, watching something extraordinary unfold. The year was 376, and along the banks of the Danube River, a scene was playing out that would change history forever. Thousands of people, entire families really, stood on the far side of that great river, calling out across the water to Roman soldiers. These weren't invaders in the traditional sense. These were refugees. Gothic families fleeing something even more terrifying than the mighty Roman Empire, the Huns. Now, the Huns, they were horse warriors from the distant east, the kind of people who seemed to materialize from nowhere like a storm cloud on the horizon. Their reputation alone was enough to send entire tribes packing, abandoning ancestral lands that their families had called home for generations. So there you have these Gothic people, clutching their few possessions, children holding tight to their parents' hands, staring across the Danube at what they hoped might be salvation. It's quite something, really, when you think about it. Here was Rome, this vast empire that stretched from the misty shores of Britain all the way to the sun-baked sands of Egypt, being asked to provide shelter. The Romans, well, they saw an opportunity. More soldiers for their armies, they thought. A human buffer zone against those terrifying Huns. Emperor Valens, sitting in his palace with all his advisors, decided to let them cross. Seemed clever at the time, you know, the way many decisions do, before we see how they actually turn out. But here's where the story takes a darker turn, because Roman officials, the sort of people who wore fancy clothes and spoke in important tones, they weren't exactly model hosts. Instead of providing the promised food and supplies, they turned the whole situation into a business opportunity. Can you imagine? These families who'd lost everything were forced to pay outrageous prices just for basic necessities. Some Gothic parents, and this breaks your heart to think about, actually had to sell their own children into slavery just to get enough grain to keep the rest of the family alive. Golden earrings, family heirlooms passed down through generations, traded away for a small sack of food. Now, you might wonder what people do when they're pushed beyond their breaking point. Well, they push back. By 378, just 2 years after that river crossing, those same Gothic families had risen in rebellion. Desperation, it turns out, can be a powerful motivator. Word of this uprising reached Constantinople, that magnificent eastern capital where marble columns caught the morning light and the streets buzzed with news from across the empire. Emperor Valens, hearing about the rebellion, decided he would personally lead an army to crush it. His advisors, wise men with grey beards and worried expressions, suggested waiting for reinforcements. But Valens, proud as emperors tend to be, waved away their concerns. These were just barbarians, after all. How could they possibly stand against a proper Roman army? Pride, as we know, can be a dangerous thing. It whispers in our ear that we're invincible right up until the moment we discover we're not. On August 9th, 378, at a place called Adrianople, Emperor Valens learned this lesson in the harshest possible way. The Gothic forces, led by a man named Fritigern, who possessed both tactical brilliance and a deep understanding of Roman weaknesses, utterly destroyed the imperial army. The emperor himself died on that battlefield, along with nearly 2/3 of his soldiers. Picture the scene: thousands of trained Roman legionnaires Men who'd marched across Europe in perfect formation, scattered and broken in a single afternoon. It was the kind of defeat that sends shockwaves through an empire, the sort of news that makes people in distant cities stop what they're doing and stare at each other in disbelief. This wasn't supposed to happen, you see. Romans were accustomed to winning battles against what they called barbarian tribes. It would be like watching a master craftsman suddenly forget how to use his tools, or seeing the sun rise in the west instead of the east. The natural order of things seemed to have shifted. In the aftermath, survivors limped back to Roman cities with haunted eyes and stories that no one wanted to believe. These weren't disorganized raiders, they reported. The Gothic cavalry had attacked with discipline and coordination. Their leaders had outsmarted Roman commanders who'd studied warfare their entire lives, and there, in that moment of defeat, something fundamental changed about the Roman world. The empire that had seemed eternal, built on foundations of marble and military might, suddenly looked fragile. Those Gothic families who'd once begged for shelter across the Danube now held Roman territory, armed and victorious, having proven that the greatest empire on earth could indeed be beaten. The news spread along those famous Roman roads, carried by messengers whose horses' hooves beat out a rhythm of uncertainty. In taverns and marketplaces, in the homes of senators and the workshops of craftsmen, people whispered the same questions. If Rome could be defeated by desperate refugees, what did that mean for the future? What other storms might be gathering on distant horizons? It's fascinating, really, how quickly things can change. One day you're the master of the known world, your eagles flying over vast territories, your engineers building aqueducts that seem to defy gravity itself. The next day, you're staring at the wreckage of everything you thought was permanent, wondering how it all went so wrong so fast. But perhaps that's the way of things, empires and individuals alike. We build our confidence on yesterday's victories, forgetting that tomorrow always brings new challenges, new tests of our strength and wisdom. The Romans had grown comfortable in their dominance, and comfort can make us complacent. In the year 382, something extraordinary happened that would reshape the ancient world forever. Emperor Theodosius made a decision that must have shocked every Roman citizen who heard about it. He signed a peace treaty with the Goths, but this wasn't just any ordinary peace agreement. For the first time in Roman history, a barbarian tribe was being allowed to settle inside the empire's sacred borders while keeping their own laws, their own leaders, their own way of life. Imagine the conversations that must have taken place in Roman homes that evening. Fathers trying to explain to their sons why the empire that had conquered the known world was now making room for outsiders. Mothers wondering what kind of future awaited their children in this new reality. The Romans had always been masters of assimilation, turning conquered peoples into Romans, but this was different. These Goths would remain Goths, living among Romans, but never becoming Roman. This moment marked the beginning of a pattern that would define the empire's final centuries. More and more barbarian groups would cross Roman borders in the decades that followed. Sometimes they came as invaders, sometimes as invited guests, but they all came with the same understanding, that the old rules no longer applied. The empire that had once seemed as permanent as the mountains was learning to bend rather than break. The irony wasn't lost on anyone paying attention. Rome was increasingly relying on these same barbarian warriors to defend its frontiers. The very people who had once been considered enemies were now holding swords in defense of Roman cities. And those frontiers themselves were becoming harder and harder to define. Where exactly did Rome end and the barbarian world begin? The question grew more complicated with each passing year. By the early 5th century, the empire had split into two halves, east and west, like a family dividing its inheritance while the patriarch still lived. The eastern half, centered around the magnificent city of Constantinople, remained wealthy and relatively secure, but the West was struggling, carrying burdens that seemed to grow heavier each season. The Western emperors had even abandoned Rome itself as their capital. They'd moved to Ravenna, a city protected by marshes, choosing safety over symbolism. When the rulers of Rome no longer felt safe living in Rome, what did that say about the empire's confidence in its own future? The marshes around Ravenna were like a moat around a castle, but castles are built by people who expect to be attacked. In Ravenna's palace, power rested in the hands of a man whose very existence embodied the empire's transformation. Stilicho was Rome's greatest general, but he was half Vandal by birth. His barbarian blood didn't diminish his loyalty to Rome. In fact, it seemed to strengthen it, as if he had something extra to prove. He served as guardian to the young Emperor Honorius, shouldering responsibilities that would have challenged even the greatest leaders of Rome's golden age. Stilicho's private conversations revealed the depth of the crisis. Britain, that distant island province that had been Roman for centuries, was being abandoned. Troops were pulled back from Hadrian's Wall to defend Italy itself. The Rhine frontier, that crucial barrier between civilization and chaos, was guarded by scattered forces stretched impossibly thin. And in the east, a new threat was emerging. Alaric was his name, and like so many of the empire's enemies, he had once been its servant. He'd worn Roman armor, carried Roman weapons, fought under Roman banners. Now, he led the Visigoths with the tactical knowledge of a Roman officer and the ambition of a barbarian king. He wanted recognition, land and gold from the empire that had trained him. When diplomacy failed, he chose war. The first invasions of Italy in 401 and 402 were like test runs. Alaric probed Roman defenses, studied their responses, learned their weaknesses. Stilicho managed to drive him back, but everyone understood this was merely a postponement, not a victory. The Gothic king would return when conditions were more favorable. Other barbarian leaders were watching too. Radagaisus led another Gothic force into Italy in 405, and though Stilicho defeated him near Florence, each victory came at a cost the empire could barely afford. Every battle depleted Rome's already limited reserves of men and money. Then came the winter that changed everything. In the closing days of 406, the Rhine River froze solid. Rivers had always been Rome's allies, natural barriers that channeled barbarian movements and gave Roman commanders time to respond. But nature sometimes chooses sides in human conflicts, and that winter, nature chose the barbarians. On December 31st, 406, as Romans prepared to celebrate the new year, Vandals, Alans, Suevi, and other tribes walked across the frozen Rhine as if it was solid ground. They poured into Gaul, that wealthy province the Romans knew as the jewel of the West. Cities that had known peace for generations suddenly found themselves under siege. Farms that had fed the empire were trampled by barbarian horses. Back in Ravenna, court politics proved more dangerous than barbarian swords. In 408, Stilicho fell victim to accusations of treason. The man who had devoted his life to defending Rome was executed by the very empire he'd served. Those who knew him understood the charges were false, but truth and politics had always been uncomfortable companions in imperial courts. Stilicho's death removed the Western Empire's most capable defender at the moment when capable defenders were needed most. With Stilicho gone, Alaric saw his opportunity. The Visigoths marched into Italy once more, but this time their destination was unmistakable. They were heading for Rome itself, the eternal city, the symbolic heart of an empire that bore its name. Rome in 410 was no longer the administrative center it had once been. Emperors ruled from other cities, bureaucrats worked in other capitals. But Rome remained. Rome, the city that had conquered the world, the place where senators still gathered to debate, where ancient temples still housed ancient gods. Its symbolic importance far outweighed its political relevance. When Alaric's warriors surrounded the city, Romans found themselves facing a reality their ancestors could never have imagined. The walls that had protected them for centuries now felt like prison walls, trapping them inside with dwindling food supplies while Gothic campfires burned just beyond bowshot. Inside the city, hunger became a constant companion. Citizens who had never known Want found themselves counting crumbs, rationing water, eyeing their neighbors' possessions with desperate calculation. An entire generation was learning that the security they'd taken for granted was as fragile as morning frost. No relief army was coming. The emperor remained safely behind Ravenna's marshes, but Rome's citizens felt abandoned, left to face their fate alone. The city that had once summoned legions from across the known world could no longer summon help from the next province over. On August 24th, 410, the Salarian Gate opened. Whether through treachery or desperation, historians still debate, but the result was the same. Alaric's warriors poured into Rome like water through a broken dam. For 3 days, the city that had ruled the world experienced rule by others. The sack wasn't the complete destruction that Romans had feared. Alaric, remembering his time in Roman service, ordered his men to respect churches and those seeking sanctuary within them. Still, the sight of Gothic warriors carrying Roman treasures through Roman streets was an image that burned itself into every witness's memory. Gold that had been accumulated over centuries was loaded onto wagons in days. Artwork that had celebrated Roman victories now decorated barbarian camps. Fires broke out in several districts, and the ancient Senate House where Cicero had once delivered speeches that shaped the Republic burned to the ground. The smoke carried with it the scent of an ending, the bitter smell of transformation. Citizens who lived through those 3 days never forgot the sound of their own world changing. One father, helping his family hide their most precious possessions, spoke for his entire generation when he whispered that Rome hadn't fallen to foreign enemies in almost 8 centuries. How could such a thing happen in their lifetime? How indeed? The mighty Roman Empire still stood after Alaric's departure. It would continue for decades more in the west and centuries in the east. But something fundamental had shifted, like a great building settling on its foundation. The invincibility of Rome, that assumption that had shaped politics and culture for generations, lay shattered. Alaric didn't stay to rule his conquest. After the sacking, he led his people southward, apparently aiming for Africa, Rome's breadbasket, and one of the empire's wealthiest provinces. But fate had other plans for the Gothic king. Near Cosenza, in southern Italy, illness claimed a life that Roman swords had never managed to touch. The Visigoth buried their king with great ceremony and greater secrecy. They temporarily diverted the Busento River, laid Alaric to rest in its bed along with treasures worthy of the man who had humbled Rome, then returned the river to its natural course. The exact location of the grave became their secret, one they kept so well that treasure hunters still search for it today. In the end, Alaric's story becomes a meditation on the nature of change itself. Empires that seem eternal prove to be temporary. Barriers that appear permanent can be crossed by determined people with iron will, and sometimes the greatest transformations come not from those who seek to destroy, but from those who seek merely to find a place to call home. The Roman world was changing, piece by piece, in ways that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations. After the dramatic events in Rome itself, the story continued to unfold across distant provinces, where new peoples were carving out their own destinies. Think about how history moves sometimes, not like a sudden storm, but like a slow river changing course. The Visigoths, led now by Atulf, Alaric's brother-in-law, began their long journey away from the ruins they had left behind in Italy. These weren't mindless wanderers anymore, but a people with purpose, seeking something that had eluded so many others, a permanent home. Southern Gaul beckoned to them, with its fertile lands and strategic position. Here, around the city of Toulouse, they would establish something remarkable, a Gothic kingdom right in the heart of what had once been purely Roman territory. It's fascinating how quickly the impossible becomes inevitable. One day, the idea of barbarian kingdoms inside the empire would have been unthinkable. Now it was simply reality. But the Visigoths weren't alone in this grand reshaping of the ancient world. The Vandals, Those same people who had crossed the Rhine back in 406 were writing their own chapter of this story. They had moved like a slow tide through Gaul, then down into Spain, leaving behind them a trail of transformation. Under their king Genseric, a man whose name would echo through history, they gained control over parts of the Iberian Peninsula, but something even more ambitious was calling to them. Across the narrow Strait of Gibraltar lay Africa, with its legendary wealth and untapped possibilities. In 429, Genseric made a decision that would change everything. He gathered his people, all 80,000 of them, Vandals and their allied Alans, men, women and children, and led them across those ancient waters. Imagine that moment, when an entire nation decided to cross the sea in search of a new future. The Roman provinces of North Africa had remained largely peaceful through all the chaos happening elsewhere in the empire. They were like a quiet corner of the house while storms raged outside. But now, that tranquility was about to end. The Vandals moved methodically, capturing territory after territory, until they reached the greatest prize of all. Carthage fell to them in 439. This wasn't just another city changing hands. Carthage was the jewel of Roman Africa, a place that had been rebuilt after its ancient destruction and had become one of the most important centers of the Mediterranean world. When Genseric's forces entered its gates, they weren't just conquering a city, they were severing one of the empire's most vital lifelines. You see, Africa was more than just another province to Rome. It was the empire's breadbasket, sending countless ships loaded with grain to feed the eternal city itself. The tax revenues from African trade filled imperial coffers and kept the machinery of government running. Without Africa, the Western Empire was like a person who had suddenly lost their strongest limb. A Roman merchant, standing in Carthage's forum under its new masters, might have put it perfectly. The East still had Egypt with all its ancient wealth and reliable harvests. But what was left for the West? Italy had been scarred by years of warfare. Gaul and Spain were being divided up among various barbarian peoples. Britain had already been abandoned, left to face whatever future awaited it alone. This wasn't just a temporary setback that clever diplomacy or military action might reverse. Something fundamental was happening to the Roman world. These weren't raiders who would eventually go home with their loot. These were settlers, people building new societies on land that had been Roman for centuries. The transformation was so gradual, so incremental, that perhaps people living through it didn't always grasp its full significance. Like watching a tree grow, the changes were too slow to notice from day to day. But over time, they reshaped everything, and there were even greater challenges gathering strength beyond the horizon. Far to the east, beyond the familiar Mediterranean world, a force was building that would soon test both halves of the divided empire. The Huns, under their legendary leader Attila, represented something different from the Germanic peoples who were settling former Roman lands. They brought with them a different kind of threat, one that would add yet another layer of pressure to an already strained system. But perhaps what's most remarkable about this whole period is how it shows us that even the mightiest civilizations don't usually end with dramatic crashes. Instead, they transform, evolve, become something new. The Roman Empire wasn't collapsing like a building struck by lightning. It was changing, adapting, becoming something that its founders might not have recognized, but which carried forward elements of what they had built. Standing on the walls of any Roman city during these years, you might have witnessed history in motion, the slow dance between old and new, between what was and what was becoming. The end of one story, perhaps, but also the beginning of many others. Picture yourself standing in the heart of Constantinople during the 4040s, when the world was shifting in ways that would echo through centuries. The massive walls stretch before you, magnificent and imposing, while the sounds of merchants and traders fill the air. This eastern jewel of the Roman Empire still gleamed with wealth and power, even as distant cousins in the west struggled with problems that seemed to grow larger each passing season. Inside the grand imperial palace, you might have witnessed something that would chill you to the bone. Officials gathered around detailed maps, their voices hushed, their faces marked with worry lines that spoke of sleepless nights. These weren't ordinary diplomatic meetings, mind you. These were discussions about survival itself. The name they whispered most often was Attila. Just saying it seemed to make grown men uncomfortable, as if speaking the name too loudly might somehow summon its owner from the northern steppes. This wasn't just another barbarian chief causing minor border troubles. This was something entirely different, something the Roman world had never quite encountered before. For decades, the Romans had grown comfortable with a particular arrangement. They paid tribute to the Huns, those nomadic horsemen from the vast grasslands beyond their borders. It wasn't ideal, certainly not something they advertised in their grand speeches about Roman glory, but it worked. Gold flowed north, peace flowed south, and everyone could sleep soundly. But Attila changed everything about this delicate balance. Along with his brother Bleda, he had managed something remarkable and terrifying. He united the Hun tribes, those scattered groups of warriors who had previously been manageable because they were divided. United, they became something else entirely, a force that could make even Constantinople's thick walls seem suddenly inadequate. The demands that came from Attila's court weren't just increases, they were multiplications. Where previous Hun leaders had asked for reasonable sums, Attila demanded amounts that made imperial treasurers pale. The comfortable arrangement that had kept peace for years suddenly became impossible to maintain. When negotiations inevitably broke down in 441, the consequences arrived with devastating swiftness. Attila led his warriors across the Danube River, that ancient boundary between civilization and the unknown, and poured into the Balkans like a flood of destruction. If you had traveled to those regions in the aftermath, you would have seen sights that would haunt your dreams. Villages that had stood for generations reduced to ash and rubble, towns where bustling markets once thrived, now stood empty, their inhabitants either fled or taken. The very landscape seemed to bear scars from the Hun attacks. What made these raids so uniquely terrifying wasn't just their brutality, it was their speed and efficiency. Roman cavalry officers, men who had spent their careers perfecting the art of war, found themselves completely outmatched. These Huns lived differently than anyone the Romans had ever encountered. Their entire existence revolved around the horse. While Roman soldiers learned to ride as one skill among many, Hun children were practically born in the saddle. They ate while riding, they slept while their horses walked, they conducted their daily lives in constant motion across the steppes. This wasn't just military training, it was a completely different way of being human. Their archery skills bordered on the supernatural from a Roman perspective. A Hun warrior could shoot with deadly accuracy while riding at full gallop, turning his entire army into a mobile storm of arrows that could appear anywhere, strike with lethal force, and vanish before any organized response could form. By 443, the Eastern Romans found themselves in a position no empire wants to face. They had to choose between continued devastation of their Balkan provinces or accepting terms that amounted to public humiliation. The tribute they agreed to pay was 3 times what they had previously considered excessive, plus massive additional payments to cover what Attila claimed they owed from previous years. The psychological impact of disagreement rippled through the empire. Here was Rome, the eternal city, the master of the known world, essentially paying protection money to nomads. It challenged everything Romans believed about their place in the cosmic order. In 445, something happened that made Attila even more formidable, if such a thing were possible. His brother Bleda died under circumstances that nobody discussed too openly. The whispers suggested that Attila himself had arranged his brother's death, though proving such things about a distant barbarian king was impossible. What mattered was the result. Attila now ruled the Hun Empire alone, without the need to consult anyone or compromise on his increasingly ambitious plans. This consolidation of power changed the entire dynamic between the Huns and Rome, where there had once been the possibility of playing different Hun factions against each other, or at least negotiating with multiple leaders. Now there was only Attila. His word was law across the vast territories the Huns controlled, and his ambitions seemed to grow with each passing season. The speed of these changes must have been bewildering to Romans who had grown up believing in the permanence of their empire. Within just a few short years, their comfortable world of predictable tributes and manageable barbarian neighbors had transformed into something far more dangerous and uncertain. At the height of his power, Attila's domain stretched far across the known world. From the Rhine River all the way to the distant Caspian Sea, this vast empire held sway. Germanic tribes either bent the knee as subjects or stood alongside him as willing allies. Even the mighty Eastern Roman Empire, with all its grandeur and ancient strength, found itself paying tribute to this barbarian king. Imagine for a moment the curiosity that must have gripped Roman minds about this mysterious leader. Stories traveled along trade routes and through military camps, painting pictures of a fearsome warrior king. When a Roman diplomatic mission prepared to venture into Attila's territory, it offered a rare chance to see the truth behind the legends. The journey itself would have been quite an adventure. Crossing the mighty Danube River, diplomats entered lands that had once been Roman provinces. Now these same territories acknowledged Hunnic rule. The shift in allegiance marked how dramatically the balance of power had changed. What the Romans discovered at Attila's headquarters must have challenged their expectations entirely. Where they might have expected crude barbarian camps, they found something quite different. The Hunnic capital consisted mainly of wooden buildings, with the largest and most impressive structures reserved for Attila himself. This wasn't the primitive settlement that Romans often imagined when they thought of barbarian peoples. Instead, it reflected a culture that valued something Romans had long forgotten: nobility over permanence. These people could move when they needed to, adapt when circumstances changed. Their architecture reflected this philosophy. The moment finally came for the Roman delegation to meet the man they called the Scourge of God. Reality often differs from legend, and Attila proved no exception. Rather than the towering giant of stories, he appeared quite short and stocky. His broad chest and large head gave him a distinctive appearance, but nothing that would inspire fear at first glance. His clothing told an interesting story too. While his nobles dressed in rich fabrics and ornate decorations, Attila himself wore surprisingly plain garments. The only notable ornament was a distinctive sword hanging at his belt. This simplicity seemed deliberate, calculated even. But his eyes, those captured attention immediately. Intense and watchful, they missed absolutely nothing. When the Roman ambassador presented expensive gifts, Attila accepted them with barely a flicker of emotion. He sat upon a wooden throne, listening with apparent indifference as flowery diplomatic speeches were translated through interpreters. Something fascinating became apparent during these exchanges. Though Attila didn't speak Latin or Greek, he seemed to understand much of what was said before the translators even began their work. This suggested a sharp intelligence behind that impassive facade. Later festivities revealed even more about this complex leader. At a feast held in honor of the Roman delegation, careful observation showed interesting contrasts. While Attila's followers drank from ornate golden and silver cups, many clearly taken from conquered Roman territories, Attila himself used a simple wooden cup. His plate too was made of wood, nothing fancy or expensive. As the evening progressed, his warriors became drunk and increasingly boisterous, but Attila remained completely sober. This restraint wasn't accidental. Roman diplomats who understood the game recognized the calculation behind such behavior. By presenting himself as uncorrupted by luxury, Attila maintained credibility with his followers, even while demanding vast amounts of gold from Rome. The stories that circulated about Attila added another layer to his mystique. Legend claimed he had discovered an ancient sword buried in the earth, supposedly the weapon of their war god. He used this discovery to claim divine right to rule the entire world. Whether his people truly believed he was a god king, or simply found it politically convenient, the story served its purpose. Divine or not, Attila certainly proved himself a masterful politician. He understood how to manipulate situations to his advantage. When a Roman official allegedly plotted his assassination, Attila seized upon this supposed insult as perfect justification for breaking his peace treaty with the Eastern Empire. In 447, he launched another massive invasion of the Balkans. The devastation that followed showed just how formidable his military machine had become. At the Battle of the Eutus River, Roman forces suffered a crushing defeat. Attila's armies advanced relentlessly, pushing almost to the very walls of Constantinople itself. The eastern capital survived this onslaught, but only because of its incredible defenses. The great Theodosian walls had been built to withstand exactly this kind of siege. Even Attila's vast hordes couldn't overcome these formidable fortifications. The city itself remained safe behind its stone barriers. The surrounding countryside told a different story entirely. Devastation stretched across the landscape as far as anyone could see. Towns and villages lay in ruins. The Eastern Empire found itself in an impossible position, forced once again to sue for peace on terms even more humiliating than before. By 450 AD, the political situation began shifting in unexpected ways. Emperor Theodosius II, who had ruled the Eastern Empire for decades, passed away. With his death came new opportunities, new alliances, and new dangers that would reshape the entire balance of power across the ancient world. When the Eastern Emperor tumbled from his horse and breathed his last, something shifted in the delicate balance of the ancient world. His successor, a man named Marcian, possessed a different kind of backbone. He looked at the tribute demands from the fearsome Huns and simply said no. The gold that had been flowing eastward for years suddenly stopped. Meanwhile, far to the west, the struggling remnants of the once mighty Roman Empire faced their own challenges. An emperor named Valentinian sat on the throne, but real power belonged to his general, a remarkable man called Flavius Aetius. This general carried within him an unusual understanding of the enemy. As a young hostage among the Huns, he had learned their customs, their language, their very way of thinking. He had even employed Hun mercenaries in his rise to power. If anyone could match wits with the coming storm, it was him. The storm had a name, Attila. And like all great conquerors, he needed a reason, a justification that would satisfy both his followers and history itself. It came in the most unexpected form. The emperor's sister, desperate to escape an arranged marriage, sent the Hun king her ring along with a plea for help. Whether she truly understood what she was doing, we may never know. But Attila saw opportunity in that simple golden band. He declared it a marriage proposal and demanded half the Western Empire as her dowry. When the Romans refused this audacious claim, the machinery of war began to turn. Attila gathered not just his Hun horsemen, but warriors from dozens of subject peoples. In the spring of the year 451, this massive force crossed the Rhine and poured into Gaul like a breaking dam. Terror moved faster than the army itself. Word of the approaching Huns spread from village to village, city to city. People abandoned their homes, loading whatever they could carry onto carts and fleeing into the countryside. Those too old or sick to run could only pray and wait. The Huns had built their reputation on fear, as much as on battlefield prowess. But something extraordinary happened in those desperate weeks. Old enemies began talking to each other. Former rivals started shaking hands. Aetius performed what might have been the greatest diplomatic achievement of the age. He convinced Visigoths and Romans to fight side by side. Burgundians marched alongside Franks. Alans and Saxons joined the growing coalition. These were peoples who had been cutting each other's throats just months before. The two great armies finally came together on the Catalonian plains, near the city of Troyes. The summer heat shimmered over thousands upon thousands of warriors, arranged in long lines across the rolling grassland. On one side stood Attila's diverse horde, Hun cavalry mixed with Germanic foot soldiers. On the other, Aetius commanded his unlikely alliance, Roman legionaries forming just one part of the colourful army. The battle began slowly, with small groups testing each other's resolve. Then both sides spotted the same prize, a ridge that commanded the entire battlefield. The fight for that high ground turned savage quickly. Men pressed forward, step by bloody step, neither army willing to yield the advantage. In the chaos, King Theodoric of the Visigoths fell beneath the trampling hooves and stabbing spears, but his death only fueled his warriors' fury. His son rallied them with cries for vengeance, and they fought with the desperate strength of men who had nothing left to lose. As the sun began to set, the field told its grim story. Bodies lay scattered across the trampled grass. Attila's forces found themselves pushed back to their wagon circle, preparing for what might be their final stand. The great conqueror himself made ready a funeral pyre of saddles. If the morning brought defeat, he would throw himself into the flames rather than face capture. But morning brought something unexpected. Aetius had pulled back his forces during the night, leaving a clear path for retreat. Perhaps the Roman general understood something deeper about victory and defeat. With the Hun threat eliminated, would his Visigoth allies become the next problem? Sometimes wisdom lies in knowing when not to finish what you started. Attila took the opportunity offered and withdrew. For the first time in his career, the master of the steppes had been stopped. Though not completely crushed, his reputation for invincibility lay as broken as the bodies on the Catalonian plains. The West had bought itself time, though at a terrible cost. The great question remained, what would the Hun king do next? Would he accept this setback, or would his pride demand another throw of the dice? Picture yourself living in those final days of the Western Roman Empire, when the world seemed to be shifting beneath everyone's feet. The year is 452, and news travels slowly, carried by messengers on horseback, spreading through markets and taverns like ripples in a pond. People gather in small groups, whispering about the latest reports from the north. Attila, the king everyone calls the scourge of God, has turned his attention toward Italy itself. For years, this man had been the nightmare that haunted Roman dreams. His armies had swept across Gaul, leaving destruction in their wake, and now they were marching south. The Western Empire had thrown everything it had into defending Gaul, sending legions and resources northward, which meant Italy sat there, almost naked, waiting for whatever might come. One by one, the cities began to fall. Each defeat sent fresh waves of panic rippling southward. When news arrived that Milan had been captured, people could hardly believe what they were hearing. Attila hadn't just taken the city, he had done something that cut deeper than any military victory. He sat himself down on the imperial throne there, right in Milan's palace, making a mockery of Roman power in the most theatrical way possible. As his forces moved closer to Rome, you could feel the terror growing in the Eternal City. Everyone remembered what had happened just 40 years earlier, when the Goths had sacked Rome in 410. That had been devastating enough, but would this be even worse? The streets filled with rumors and desperate prayers. Then something remarkable happened, something that would become one of history's most fascinating mysteries. An embassy left Rome to meet with Attila, but this wasn't the usual diplomatic mission. No general led this group, no imperial official with his retinue of advisors and guards. Instead, the man at the front was Pope Leo, a religious leader, stepping into the world of international politics and warfare. The meeting took place near the banks of the River Po, close to Mantua. Picture that scene, the contrast almost surreal. On one side stood Attila, the warrior king who had terrorized Europe, surrounded by his battle-hardened soldiers. On the other side was Pope Leo, dressed in his clerical robes, carrying nothing but his words and whatever authority his position might hold. Nobody recorded what they actually said to each other during those crucial moments. The conversation that might have changed the course of history remains locked away in time, lost to us forever. But what happened afterwards speaks volumes. After that meeting, Attila gave orders that must have shocked his own army. They were withdrawing from Italy, turning back from the very gates of Rome. Later generations, hungry for explanations of this miraculous turnaround, created legends that grew more elaborate with each telling. Some said that during their conversation, Attila suddenly saw the apostles Peter and Paul hovering in the air above Pope Leo's head, their faces stern with divine warning. These ghostly figures supposedly threatened the Hun king with terrible punishment if he dared attack the holy city of Rome. But history often has more mundane explanations hiding behind its miraculous moments. Attila's army was probably suffering from disease, that constant companion of ancient military campaigns. Food supplies might have been running dangerously low, and there was always the Eastern Front to worry about. The Eastern Roman Empire was making threatening moves against Hun territory along the Danube River. Sometimes the most practical reasons lie behind the most legendary decisions. Whatever caused Attila's change of heart, Rome found itself spared once again. The city that had survived for centuries would continue for a while longer, but then, just 1 year later, in 453, news arrived that nobody had quite expected. Attila was dead. For such a legendary figure, a man who had struck fear into the hearts of emperors and changed the map of Europe, his death was almost comically ordinary. He had been celebrating his wedding to yet another wife, because Attila collected wives the way other men collected horses. After the festivities, he retired to his bed, probably heavy with food and drink. Sometime during the night, he suffered a nosebleed, nothing unusual for a middle-aged man. But this time, lying flat on his back in his sleep, he choked on his own blood. Of course, rumors started immediately. People whispered about poison, about assassination plots, about enemies who had finally found a way to reach the unreachable king. But nothing was ever proven. And sometimes history's turning points come down to something as simple and random as a nosebleed in the night. You might expect that Attila's death would bring nothing but relief to the Roman world, and in many ways it did. The great threat that had loomed over Europe for decades was suddenly gone. But history has a way of creating new problems, even as it solves old ones. The Hunnic Empire had been held together mainly by Attila's personality, his ability to command loyalty and fear in equal measure. With him gone, that vast confederation began to crumble almost immediately. His sons started fighting among themselves for the right to inherit their father's power. Various peoples who had been forced to serve under Hun rule saw their chance and rose in rebellion. The entire map of Central and Eastern Europe began shifting again, tribes and nations carving out new territories from the wreckage of Attila's empire. For the Western Roman Empire, this created an unexpected paradox. While the immediate Hun threat had disappeared, they had lost something else in the process. Attila's power had actually created a kind of stability, the stability that comes from fear. Germanic tribes and other peoples had been kept in check by the knowledge that the Hun king was watching, ready to strike down anyone who got too ambitious. Now that restraint was gone, and all those suppressed ambitions were suddenly free to flourish. The death of one man had changed everything, proving once again how much of history hangs on individual lives and random moments. The Western Roman Empire would discover that sometimes your enemies can be more useful than you realize, and that the end of one threat often means the beginning of many others. Picture that moment in history, when empires begin to crumble, not with grand battles, but with a single foolish decision. The dust had barely settled after Attila's death, when everything started falling apart for Rome. There was this emperor, Valentinian III, sitting in his palace at Ravenna, stewing in his own jealousy. His best general, a man named Aetius, had just saved the entire empire from the Huns. You'd think that would earn him gratitude, maybe a nice retirement villa somewhere. Instead, it earned him suspicion. Power has this strange way of making people paranoid, especially when they know, deep down, they don't really deserve it. On September 21st, in the year 454, Aetius walked into what he thought was just another boring meeting about finances. He's probably carrying scrolls, maybe thinking about dinner, completely unaware that his emperor had been plotting against him. Then, without warning, Valentinian drew his sword and struck down the very man who had saved his empire as Aetius lay dying on those cold palace floors. Someone in the room, a courtier with more wisdom than his emperor, said something that would echo through history. "You have cut off your right hand with your left," he told Valentinian. Those words turned out to be more than just a clever metaphor. 6 months passed, and revenge found its way to the emperor. 2 of Aetius's former guards decided their dead commander deserved justice. They assassinated Valentinian, and suddenly Rome found itself without both its best general and its emperor, however incompetent he might have been. What followed was like watching dominoes fall in slow motion. Emperor after emperor took the throne, each one weaker than the last. None of them had the strength or the connections to stop what was coming. The real power started shifting to military commanders, many of whom weren't even Roman by birth. These were the descendants of those so-called barbarians, now holding the puppet strings of empire. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Down in North Africa, there was this Vandal king named Gaiseric, who had done something remarkable, something that would have shocked Romans a century earlier. He had built a fleet, a proper naval force. Germanic peoples weren't supposed to be sailors. They were land warriors, forest dwellers. Yet here was Gaiseric mastering the Mediterranean like some ancient sea king. In 455, just 3 months after Valentinian's assassination, that fleet appeared at the mouth of the Tiber River. Imagine being a Roman citizen, looking out toward the sea, and seeing those foreign ships approaching your eternal city. Rome had already been sacked by the Goths 45 years earlier. And now history was repeating itself with a cruel twist. The city had no real defenses left. The gates opened, not in welcome, but in resignation. Pope Leo, who had successfully negotiated with Attila before, tried his diplomatic skills again. This time, though, he had less success. The best he could manage was a promise that Rome wouldn't burn and its people wouldn't be massacred. For 14 long days, the Vandals worked methodically through the city. This wasn't the frenzied destruction you might imagine. It was calculated, almost businesslike. They took gold and silver, of course, but they also stripped copper from rooftops, loaded fine furniture onto their ships, and even took people as prizes. The Empress Eudoxia, Valentinian's widow, found herself a captive along with her daughters. Imagine the irony. The wife of the emperor, who had started this whole catastrophe by killing his best general, now being led away to a foreign land. When the Vandals finally sailed away, they left behind a Rome that was still standing, still breathing, but materially broken. The city looked like a house after a very thorough burglary, everything of value carefully removed. It's fascinating how our language preserves these ancient wounds. The word vandalism comes directly from this event, though history tells us the Vandals were actually quite disciplined compared to their reputation. Gaiseric's operation was strategic, purposeful. He knew exactly what he wanted and took it without unnecessary destruction. This calculated approach reveals something profound about how civilizations transfer wealth and power. It wasn't random violence, it was economic warfare, the systematic extraction of an empire's accumulated riches. The Vandals understood that destroying Rome completely would serve no purpose, but draining it, that was valuable. Long before the final curtain fell, the Western Roman Empire found itself in a peculiar state of existence. Picture something that lives on in name alone, while everything that once gave it meaning slowly slips away. This was Rome in the 5th century, a shadow of its former self, yet still clinging to the idea of what it once was. The empire had already lost so much by this point. Britain, with its misty hills and distant shores, had long since passed from Roman hands. The fertile lands of Gaul, where wine flowed and trade flourished, now belonged to others. Spain's rich silver mines no longer filled Roman coffers, and North Africa, that jewel across the Mediterranean, had become a foreign land. Even Italy itself, the very heart of the empire, had suffered invasion after invasion, like waves beating against a crumbling cliff. But there was something different about losing North Africa. It wasn't just another province slipping away. This was the empire's last real source of wealth, the place where grain ships loaded their holds before sailing to feed Rome's hungry masses. Without it, the entire economic foundation began to crack and crumble. In the year 468, something remarkable happened. Both halves of the divided Roman world, East and West, decided to join forces for one final, desperate gamble. They set their sights on the Vandal kingdom in North Africa, hoping to reclaim what had been lost. It was like watching two old friends, long estranged, coming together for one last great adventure. The Eastern Emperor, known as Leo I, threw everything he had into this campaign. The numbers that historians whisper about are almost too grand to believe. Over 1,000 ships, they say, and perhaps 100,000 men. Even if these figures grew larger in the telling, as numbers often do, this was still the greatest naval expedition the Mediterranean had witnessed in centuries. Just imagine the sight of it all. Ships stretching to the horizon, their sails catching the wind like clouds, descended to earth. The sound of thousands of oars cutting through the water in rhythm. The hopes and dreams of an entire empire carried on those wooden hulls across the blue expanse of the ancient sea. The fleet gathered at Sicily first, that triangular island sitting like a stepping stone between Italy and Africa. Here, forces from both empires came together, though the eastern half provided most of the ships and men. After all, they still had the wealth to afford such grand gestures. Among the Roman troops and sailors, you could almost taste the hope in the air. Many believed this would be the moment when everything changed, when Roman eagles would once again soar over African skies. Across the water, the Vandals waited. Now, these weren't your typical barbarian raiders. They had learned the ways of the sea, becoming masters of naval warfare in their adopted homeland. Their kingdom had grown rich and powerful, built on the foundation of what Rome had lost. But leading them was an old man named Gaiseric, a king who had reached his 70s through cunning rather than luck. Gaiseric understood something that many rulers forget. Sometimes the best victory comes not from meeting strength with strength, but from turning an enemy's power against itself. As the massive Roman fleet approached Cape Bon, near the ancient city of Carthage, the Vandal king prepared his masterstroke. Fire has always been one of humanity's most faithful servants, but also one of its most dangerous. The Vandals loaded old ships with anything that would burn: pitch, oil, dried wood, anything that loved to dance with flames. Then they waited for the wind to turn in their favor, nature herself becoming their ally. What happened next shows how quickly triumph can turn to disaster. The fire ships, blazing like floating torches, sailed straight into the heart of the Roman fleet. The Roman ships, packed tightly together for protection, became their own worst enemy. Fire leaped from vessel to vessel like an eager child playing hopscotch, spreading faster than anyone could react. Panic is a terrible thing to witness. Trained soldiers and experienced sailors, men who had faced death before, suddenly found themselves scrambling like frightened animals. Some jumped into the sea, preferring to take their chances with the waves rather than the flames. Others tried desperately to cut their ships free from the burning mass, but it was too late. The Mediterranean that day became a graveyard of Roman ambitions. Ship after ship succumbed to the flames, taking with them not just men and materials, but something far more precious. Hope itself seemed to burn away with the fleet, leaving nothing but smoke and the bitter taste of defeat. Among the survivors, those lucky few who managed to escape the floating inferno, conversations turned dark. Old veterans, men who had seen empires rise and fall, spoke in hushed tones about what this disaster really meant. One soldier, his face weathered by years of service, put it simply enough for anyone to understand. No Africa meant no money. No money meant no soldiers. And without soldiers, what empire could survive? The mathematics of power had always been brutally simple. Armies needed food, weapons, and pay. All of these required wealth, and wealth came from productive provinces. With North Africa lost, and now this final attempt at recovery turned to ash and smoke, the Western Empire found itself facing an impossible equation. This wasn't just about losing a single battle. though that was painful enough. This was about losing the last realistic chance to reverse a century of decline. The Western Empire would continue to exist on paper. Its officials would still use grand titles, and the name of Rome would still echo through the halls of power in Ravenna, but substance was draining away like water through a broken pot. What's fascinating is how long an empire can survive on momentum alone. The idea of Rome had become so powerful, so embedded in people's understanding of the world, that it continued to exist even when the reality had largely vanished. It's like watching the last light of sunset linger in the sky, long after the sun has disappeared below the horizon. The transformation had been gradual, almost gentle, in its way. From that moment in 376, when Gothic refugees first appeared at the Danube frontier, to this disaster off the African coast, nearly a century had passed. Generations had grown up watching the empire slowly change, piece by piece, province by province, until something entirely new had taken its place. But empires, like people, don't always know when to let go. The Western Roman Empire would continue its ghostly existence for a few more years, still claiming authority it no longer possessed, still dreaming of restoration that would never come. Sometimes the most poignant moments in history come not with dramatic endings, but with quiet fadlings, like candles burning down to their final flicker of light. Picture the golden Mediterranean sun casting long shadows across a land that once commanded the known world. By 470 AD, something remarkable was happening to the mighty Western Roman Empire. It was slowly dissolving, like salt in water, almost imperceptibly at first. The empire had just thrown everything it had at the Vandals in North Africa. Ships, soldiers, gold, all of it gone. It was like watching someone bet their life savings on a single hand of cards and lose. What remained of Rome's treasure chests echoed empty, and the military barely existed anymore. On maps, the empire still looked impressive. In reality, it had shrunk to just Italy and tiny pieces of Gaul and Dalmatia. Even in these remaining territories, Roman authority had become something like a whisper in a thunderstorm. People heard it, sometimes, but it carried no real weight. In Ravenna, the empire's capital, a fascinating dance of power was taking place. Emperor Anthemius sat on the throne, wearing purple robes and golden crowns. But everyone knew the real emperor was someone else entirely. His name was Ricimer, and he wasn't even fully Roman. Ricimer came from mixed heritage, part Suebi, part Visigoth. For years, he had been the true master of the Western Empire, choosing emperors like a director casting actors in a play. He would elevate men to the highest office, then remove them when they no longer served his purposes. The relationship between Anthemius and Ricimer grew bitter, like wine left too long in the sun. Two powerful men sharing one throne never works for long. Human nature simply won't allow it. In 472, their tension exploded into warfare. Ricimer laid siege to Rome itself, with his own emperor trapped inside. For 5 long months, the eternal city suffered. People ate whatever they could find. Children cried from hunger. The great city that had once fed the world now starved. When Ricimer's forces finally broke through, Anthemius tried something desperate. He dressed as a beggar, covering his imperial features with rags and dirt. Perhaps he thought he could slip away, anonymous among the poor. But power leaves traces on a man's face, and someone recognized him. They dragged him before his captors, and his story ended there. Ricimer placed his own choice, Olybrius, on the throne, but fate has a sense of irony. Within months, both Ricimer and Olybrius died of natural causes, the puppet master and his puppet, gone together, leaving behind only chaos. What followed resembled a bizarre game. Licinius became emperor next, but the Eastern Empire in Constantinople disapproved. They sent their own candidate, Julius Nepos, backed by Eastern armies. Nepos forced Glycerius to become a bishop, trading imperial purple for religious robes. Watching these rapid changes, Roman senators felt like spectators at a strange performance. Emperors came and went like actors in different scenes, but the play itself was clearly ending. Each transition brought less ceremony, less respect, less belief in the whole system. Behind this imperial theater, the real transformation was taking place. Roman armies had become an endangered species. The empire simply couldn't afford purely Roman soldiers anymore. Instead, barbarian tribes provided warriors under treaty arrangements, fighting for Rome while maintaining their own identities and loyalties. These federate troops brought their own commanders, their own customs, their own ideas about loyalty and power. Gradually, these barbarian military leaders became the true power brokers of the empire. In 475, one such commander made his decisive move. Orestes had an unusual background, even for those strange times. He had once served as secretary to Attila the Hun, that legendary king who had terrorized Europe. Now Orestes commanded armies for Rome, showing how completely the world had changed. Orestes rebelled against Julius Nepos, driving the emperor from Italy back to distant Dalmatia. But instead of claiming the throne himself, Orestes made an interesting choice. He proclaimed his young son, Romulus, as emperor. The boy was probably around 12 years old. Imagine a child, barely old enough to understand politics, suddenly declared ruler of what remained of the Roman Empire. His enemies mockingly called him Augustulus, Little Augustus, a nickname that highlighted the vast distance between this boy and Rome's great first emperor, Augustus. Nobody expected that this child would hold a unique place in history. He would be remembered not for what he accomplished, but for what ended with him. The title of Western Roman Emperor, which had existed for over 5 centuries, would die with this boy who barely understood what it meant. The irony was profound. Rome began with Augustus, a man who transformed a republic into an empire through intelligence, political skill, and military genius. It would end with Augustulus, a child who owed his position entirely to his father's ambition, possessing neither the power nor the understanding to rule anything at all. Imagine a young boy, barely in his teens, wearing robes of imperial purple that seem far too heavy for his small shoulders. This is Romulus Augustulus, the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire, though he doesn't truly understand what that means yet. His sad eyes carry a weight that no child should bear, and when you look at him, you see someone who knows, deep down, that he's simply playing a role in someone else's story. The boy speaks quietly about his father's expectations, how he must be brave like the legendary Romulus who founded Rome over 1,000 years before. But there's something heartbreaking in the way he mentions the soldiers' whispered conversations, how they believe he'll be remembered not as a great founder, but as the final chapter in a story that's already ending. Children have a way of hearing truths that adults try to hide, and this particular child has heard perhaps the most profound truth of all. The year is 476 AD, and the empire that once stretched from Britain to the deserts of Africa has shrunk to just Italy and a few scattered territories. The armies that defend this last remnant aren't filled with citizens of Rome anymore, but with Hariri warriors from the northern forests, Syrian fighters from distant lands, and other so-called barbarian troops who have made Rome's battles their own. These men have families, dreams of land, to call home, and they're tired of being paid only in coins and promises. They approach Orestes, the boy emperor's father and the real power behind the throne, with a request that seems reasonable enough. They want what their fellow soldiers have received in other former Roman territories, 1/3 of Italy's land to settle on permanently. It's not an unusual arrangement, this trading of territory for military service. Across Gaul, across Spain, across North Africa, Rome has been making such deals for decades now. But Orestes refuses, and his reasoning reveals something about how some Romans still see their world. Italy isn't just another province to be divided up. He insists it's the sacred heart of the empire, the land where Caesar walked, where Augustus built his legacy. To parcel it out to foreign soldiers would be to admit that Rome itself is no longer Roman. There's a tragic nobility in this stance, and also a fatal blindness to how much the world has already changed. The mutiny that follows is led by Odoacer, a man whose very life story tells you everything about this transformed empire. Born among the Syrian people, he's risen through Roman ranks, learned Roman military tactics, absorbed Roman political wisdom. He's more Roman than many Romans in some ways, yet he'll always be considered an outsider. When the troops declare for him, instead of Orestes, it happens with stunning speed, like a house of cards, finally surrendering to a breeze that's been building for years. Orestes flees to Pavia, that ancient city in northern Italy, but there's nowhere left to run in an empire that's become smaller than some modern countries. His execution on August 28, 476 AD, removes the last barrier between Odoacer and the throne. Though what happens next surprises everyone who witnesses it. When Odoacer's forces enter Ravenna days later, you might expect dramatic scenes of conquest, the kind of thing poets write about. Instead, what unfolds on September 4th feels almost anticlimactic, like the quiet ending of a long, exhausting story. The date will be remembered by historians as marking the fall of the Western Roman Empire, but to those living through it, it probably feels more like a tired sigh than a thunderclap. The confrontation between Odoacer and young Romulus carries an unexpected gentleness. Here's this battle-hardened commander, surrounded by armed men who could take anything they wanted by force, and he speaks to the child emperor with something approaching kindness. There's no need for grand gestures or violent displays. Everyone in the room understands that the game is already over. When Odoacer tells the boy that he must give up the throne, he makes promises about comfort and safety that he doesn't have to make. You can see relief flooding across the child's face as he removes the imperial regalia. Each piece, the purple cloak, the diadem, the ceremonial ornaments, carrying centuries of history that's now coming to an end. For this boy, giving up the throne isn't a tragedy. It's a liberation from a role that was always too big for him. The pension of 6,000 gold solidi that Romulus receives is genuinely generous, enough to live like a wealthy nobleman for the rest of his days. His exile to a villa in Campania isn't really exile at all. It's more like an early retirement to one of the most beautiful regions in Italy. Compared to the violent ends that met so many other deposed rulers throughout history, this peaceful transition feels almost miraculous. There's something deeply human about this moment, when empires change hands not through epic battles, but through quiet conversations between men who understand that times have changed. The Western Roman Empire doesn't fall with the crash of collapsing walls, but with the soft rustling of imperial robes being carefully folded and put away, perhaps forever. Odoacer stood at a crossroads of history, holding the imperial regalia in his hands, and what he chose to do next would surprise everyone. Instead of placing the crown on his own head, as so many before him had done, he made a calculation that was both brilliant and humble. He carefully wrapped these symbols of power, the crown, the scepter, the purple robes, and sent them east to Constantinople. The message that accompanied these treasures was written with the skill of a diplomat. Odoacer told Emperor Zeno something remarkable, that Italy no longer needed its own emperor. He would rule as king, Rex as they called it, while recognizing Zeno as the one true emperor of what could still be called a Roman Empire. It was like acknowledging that there could only be one sun in the sky, even if that sun was very far away. This wasn't just generosity or humility, though. It was political genius wrapped in respectful language. By doing this, Odoacer gained something precious, legitimacy from the East, while keeping what he really wanted, complete control over Italy in practice. It was like having your cake and eating it too, but with empires instead of dessert. Zeno, sitting in his palace overlooking the Bosphorus, received this offer with mixed feelings. He tried a few times to restore Nepos, who was still claiming to be the rightful Western emperor from his exile in Dalmatia, but these attempts failed like trying to restart a fire with wet wood. Eventually, Zeno accepted the arrangement, perhaps realizing that half a solution was better than no solution at all. This raises a fascinating question that would have kept philosophers awake at night. Was the Roman Empire truly dead, Or had it simply changed its clothes? A Roman jurist watching Germanic soldiers patrol the streets of Ravenna might have said that legally, no, the empire lived on in Constantinople. Odo Weixer was just another administrator, ruling in the emperor's name, but then he would have pointed to those same soldiers, with their different armor and unfamiliar customs, and admitted that something fundamental had shifted. The truth is, empires rarely die with a bang. They usually fade like old photographs, slowly and then suddenly. For most ordinary people in Italy, the change felt less dramatic than we might imagine. They still woke up in the same houses, worked the same jobs, paid taxes to officials who spoke Latin, and followed Roman laws. Odo Weixer was clever enough to keep the machinery of government mostly intact. The Senate still gathered in Rome, though their debates carried less weight than before. Roman law still governed contracts and crimes. Catholic Christianity remained the religion of choice, even though Odo Weixer himself followed Arian Christianity, a different branch that many Germanic peoples had adopted. If you had traveled through Italy during those early years of his reign, you would have found a land that looked surprisingly familiar. In the countryside, the great estates called latifundia continued operating much as they had for centuries. These sprawling farms had been the backbone of Roman agriculture, and Odo Weixer saw no reason to disturb a system that worked. He did distribute some lands to his followers, of course. Loyalty needed to be rewarded, but he did so carefully. In the cities, the municipal governments kept functioning, though with tighter budgets than before. A city councillor in Milan might have explained that the biggest change wasn't chaos or destruction, but actually relief. The enormous cost of supporting an imperial court, with all its ceremonies and bureaucracy, and maintaining massive armies, had been like a weight on everyone's shoulders. Odo Weixer's needs were simpler, his court smaller, his army more modest. In some ways, life had actually become easier for ordinary citizens, but while Italy found this unexpected stability under its barbarian king, the wider world was spinning into something completely new. Beyond the Alps and across the Mediterranean, the map of Europe was being redrawn with invisible ink that was just starting to appear. In Gaul, the Visigothic kingdom was like a growing plant, spreading its roots deeper and wider, absorbing the last Roman territories bit by bit. The Burgundians had made themselves comfortable in the Rhone Valley, turning it into their own little kingdom. Meanwhile, various Frankish groups were squabbling and fighting in northern Gaul until a young leader named Clovis began pulling them together like gathering scattered sheep into one flock. This would eventually become the Kingdom of France, though nobody called it that yet. Across the Mediterranean, the Vandal kingdom in North Africa remained a force to be reckoned with. Old Gizeric, who had been causing trouble for Romans for nearly 50 years, finally died in 477. His passing marked the end of an era, like the last page of a very long and eventful book. Spain had become a patchwork quilt, with Visigoths controlling some areas, the Suevi others, and bits of Roman territory, scattered here and there, like islands in an archipelago. Perhaps most dramatically, Britain had transformed beyond recognition. The Romans had abandoned it decades earlier, like landlords walking away from a house they couldn't afford to maintain. Into this vacuum had come the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, peoples from across the North Sea who brought their own languages, customs, and ambitions. They were gradually pushing back the Romanized British population, establishing kingdoms with names that would echo through history. The unified imperial system that had once stretched from Britain to North Africa, from Spain to the Rhine, had fractured into a collection of successor kingdoms. Each was ruled by Germanic peoples who had absorbed Roman culture like sponges, absorbing water, some more, some less, but all changed by the contact. In 480, another thread connecting the present to the past was finally cut. Julius Nepos, still insisting he was the legitimate Western emperor from his refuge in Dalmatia, was assassinated by his own retainers. It was a sad end to a sad story, like the final notes of a song that had been playing too long. Odo Weixer wasted no time in annexing Dalmatia to his own kingdom, adding another piece to his growing realm. For 12 more years, Odo Weixer ruled Italy with skill and determination. He defended the borders like a watchman guarding his post, even conducting successful campaigns against the Rugians to the north. But history, as it often does, was preparing another surprise, another turn in the endless story of power and ambition. In the swampy fortress city of Ravenna, where Roman emperors once hid from barbarian invasions, another king finds himself trapped. Odoacer, the Germanic chieftain who had ended the Western Roman Empire, sits behind massive walls, watching enemy campfires flicker in the darkness beyond. But this isn't just another barbarian raid. This is something far more calculated, orchestrated from the marble halls of Constantinople itself. You see, Emperor Zeno had grown tired of watching Odoacer grow stronger in Italy. The Eastern Roman Empire still existed, still claimed authority over the lost Western territories, but claiming and controlling were two very different things. Zeno had a problem, actually two problems, and like the clever politician he was, he saw a way to solve both at once. The first problem sat in Italy, wearing royal robes and issuing commands as if he truly owned the peninsula. The second problem wandered the Balkans, burning villages and demanding tribute. These were the Ostrogoths, cousins to those other Goths who had sacked Rome decades earlier, a proud warrior people with too much time and too little land. Their leader was a man named Theodoric, but he wasn't your typical barbarian chieftain. As a boy, he had been taken to Constantinople as a hostage, a common practice to ensure good behavior from conquered peoples. But something interesting had happened during those years in the imperial capital. Young Theodoric had absorbed Roman culture like a sponge, absorbs water, learning to speak perfect Greek and Latin, studying military tactics, observing court ceremonies. Now this educated barbarian king was causing headaches for the very empire that had trained him. His people raided imperial territories, demanding more land, more tribute, more recognition. Zeno watched this chaos unfold and saw opportunity where others saw crisis. In the year 488, imperial messengers rode out to the Ostrogothic camps with an offer that would reshape the entire Mediterranean world. Zeno's proposal was elegant in its simplicity, deadly in its implications. If Theodoric would take his people to Italy and remove Odoacer from power, he could rule the peninsula as Constantinople's representative. For Zeno, this arrangement solved everything beautifully. Either Theodoric would succeed, replacing one barbarian king with another, who might prove more loyal, or the two Germanic forces would weaken each other fighting, perhaps allowing imperial troops to reclaim Italy later. It was the kind of chess move that emperors dreamed about, using your enemies to destroy each other. Theodoric accepted without hesitation. What followed was one of those great migrations that marked the end of the ancient world, entire populations moving across continents like slow rivers of humanity. In autumn 488, the entire Ostrogothic nation began their journey from the Balkans toward Italy. Warriors rode alongside wagons carrying women, children, and elderly, all their worldly possessions creaking along mountain paths toward an uncertain future. Picture Roman diplomats meeting this strange procession as it crossed the Julian Alps into northeastern Italy. They found themselves face to face with Theodoric, a figure who embodied the blending of two worlds. He dressed in styles that mixed Roman elegance with Gothic practicality, spoke with the refined accent of someone educated in imperial courts, yet commanded fierce loyalty from warriors who still painted their shields with ancient tribal symbols. When these diplomatic envoys approached, Theodoric's message was clear and chilling. He claimed to come by the emperor's direct command, insisted that Italy needed only one ruler, and that Constantinople had chosen him for that role. He even offered mercy to Odoacer, if the current king would simply step aside and submit. But men who have tasted power rarely surrender it willingly, and Odoacer had no intention of abandoning the kingdom he had spent years building. The stage was set for a conflict that would determine whether Italy remained under Germanic control or returned to some form of Roman authority. The first battle came in August 489 at the Isonzo River near Aquileia, where Odoacer's forces met Theodoric's army in desperate combat. Despite fighting with the courage of men defending their homes, Odoacer's troops were overwhelmed and forced to retreat. A second battle at Verona ended similarly, with Theodoric's better trained, more disciplined forces claiming victory once again. With these defeats, Odoacer made the same choice that Western emperors had made when faced with barbarian invasions. He retreated to Ravenna, that marshy stronghold that had protected Roman rulers during the empire's final decades. The city's unique geography made it nearly impregnable, surrounded by swamps and connected to the sea for supply lines. What followed was a siege that stretched across years, a grinding test of endurance that devastated much of northern Italy. Both sides settled in for a long struggle, with Theodoric's forces surrounding the city while Odoacer's men held the walls. Occasionally, the monotony was broken by skirmishes or desperate sorties, including one surprising counterattack where Odoacer temporarily drove Theodoric's army back. But mostly, it was waiting, watching, hoping the other side would collapse first from exhaustion or starvation or simple despair. By 490, the siege had become a way of life for both armies, a deadly routine that continued month after month, season after season. 3 years passed this way, 3 years of warfare that left the countryside in ruins and both kings struggling to maintain their forces' loyalty. Neither side could claim decisive advantage, neither could break the deadlock that was slowly destroying everything they fought to control. Finally, in early 493, exhaustion forced both rulers to consider alternatives to endless warfare. The Bishop of Ravenna, one of those churchmen who often served as mediators in an age of constant conflict, proposed a solution that seemed almost too good to be true. Why not share power, rule Italy jointly as co-regents, combining their strengths instead of destroying each other? On March 5, 493, the gates of Ravenna opened peacefully for the first time in 3 years. Theodoric entered the city not as a conqueror, but as a partner in this new arrangement. A great feast was organized to celebrate this unprecedented agreement, a banquet that would bring together the elites of both factions. Imagine being present at that historic dinner, watching Ostrogothic nobles mix with Odoacer's followers, seeing Roman officials who had served both regimes nervously trying to navigate this strange new political landscape. At the head table, the two kings reclined together, sharing wine and seemingly cordial conversation, though the atmosphere remained thick with tension beneath its hopeful surface. Then, in a moment that would echo through medieval history, everything changed. Theodoric rose from his place, approached Odoacer with what seemed like friendly intention, then suddenly drew his sword and struck down his supposed partner. The planned co-regency had been nothing but an elaborate trap, a way to get close enough to eliminate his rival permanently. Odoacer supporters, having been required to leave their weapons outside the banquet hall, found themselves defenseless as Theodoric's men moved to complete their master's treacherous plan. The dream of shared rule died in blood and betrayal, replaced by the harsh reality of winner-takes-all politics. In the days that followed, Theodoric's forces systematically hunted down Odoacer's remaining supporters and family members, ensuring that no one could later challenge the new king's authority. This brutal but effective approach would become a common pattern throughout the early medieval period, as competing rulers learned that mercy was often just delayed suicide. Across the sprawling territories where Rome once held absolute power, something fascinating was happening. Kings and chieftains were discovering that conquest was just the beginning. The real challenge, it turned out, was figuring out how to actually run these places once you had them. In Italy, after Odoacer's fall, Theodoric found himself facing this exact puzzle. Here he was, a Gothic king sitting in Ravenna, technically representing the Eastern Emperor, but really calling his own shots. For 33 years, until death claimed him in 526, he would wrestle with one of history's most delicate balancing acts. Think about it, really. Theodoric needed to be Roman enough that the locals wouldn't revolt, but Gothic enough that his own warriors wouldn't abandon him. It was like walking a tightrope, every single day, for more than 3 decades. What's remarkable is how well he managed it. The Roman Senate kept meeting, just as it had for centuries. The old administrative machinery kept turning its wheels. Educated Romans like Cassiodorus and Boethius found themselves in high positions, their expertise valued and needed. There was even a kind of legal dualism at work. Romans lived under Roman law, as they always had. Goths followed their own customary traditions. Two peoples, two systems, one kingdom. It was an arrangement that somehow worked, at least for a while. Theodoric understood something important about power. Military strength alone couldn't sustain a kingdom. He spent enormous effort on building projects, fixing crumbling infrastructure, making sure grain flowed into the cities. In one public address, he declared that Gothic strength existed to protect Roman civilization. It was a bold statement, really, claiming the role of guardians for a culture that wasn't originally their own. But beneath this apparent harmony, tensions simmered. Religion, as it so often does, created invisible walls between people. Theodoric and his Goths followed Arian Christianity, while most Romans adhered to what we now call Catholic Christianity. These weren't just theological differences. They were markers of identity, loyalty, belonging. The religious divide went back decades to the Council of Nicaea in 325, when the empire had officially endorsed one form of Christianity over others. Now, in the aftermath of imperial collapse, these old religious fault lines became political problems that wouldn't go away. Meanwhile, Constantinople watched from afar with deep ambivalence. The Eastern emperors had never really accepted Gothic rule in Italy as anything more than a temporary arrangement. They tolerated it, sometimes even supported it, but always with the understanding that this was not the natural order of things. Across the former Western provinces, other kings were working through similar challenges. Each successor kingdom developed its own recipe for blending Germanic leadership with Roman institutions. It was like a vast experiment, conducted simultaneously across multiple laboratories. The Vandals in North Africa took a different approach. They maintained sharper distinctions between conquerors and conquered, ruling more as foreign overlords than as integrated leaders. The Visigoths in Spain and southern Gaul gradually moved toward greater integration, slowly erasing some of the lines that separated Gothic rulers from Roman subjects. But perhaps the most significant development was happening in northern Gaul, where Clovis, king of the Franks, made a decision that would echo through centuries. Unlike his contemporary rulers, he converted to Catholic Christianity, the same faith practiced by his Roman subjects. His baptism around 496 wasn't just a personal spiritual choice, it was a political masterstroke that created an alliance between Frankish military power and the Catholic Church. This partnership would become one of the defining features of medieval Europe, shaping everything from law to culture to international relations. By the early 500s, the dust had settled enough to see the new map clearly. Western Europe had reorganized itself into several major kingdoms. Theodoric's Ostrogothic realm in Italy, the Visigothic territories in Spain and southwestern Gaul, the Vandal kingdom controlling North Africa's crucial grain-producing regions. The Burgundians had carved out their own space in southeastern Gaul. The Franks were rapidly expanding their influence in the north. Across the Channel, various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were establishing themselves in what had once been Roman Britain, and through it all, the Eastern Roman Empire endured, watching these developments with a mixture of resignation and hope. They still thought of themselves simply as Romans, the continuation of an unbroken imperial tradition. To them, what was happening in the West was temporary, an interruption rather than an ending. It's fascinating how each of these kingdoms became laboratories for cultural fusion. Some experiments worked better than others, some created lasting institutions, others collapsed within generations, but all of them were grappling with the same fundamental question: how do you build something new while honoring something old? The answer, it turned out, was different everywhere you looked, which perhaps tells us something profound about human adaptability, about how societies reinvent themselves when old certainties crumble away. There was once a senator in Rome, an old man who had lived through incredible times. He would sit on a hill overlooking the ancient city, watching the sun set over monuments that had seen centuries pass by. This senator remembered when he was young, when Gothic armies had swept through the streets below. He had thought it was the end of everything, but time had taught him something surprising. Rome hadn't really fallen at all. It had simply become something new. The world around him was transforming in ways that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations. Where once there had been a single, mighty empire, stretching from Britain all the way to the deserts of Egypt, now there were many smaller kingdoms, each one ruled over pieces of what had once been Roman territory. But here's the fascinating thing. These new rulers didn't try to erase everything Roman. Instead, they embraced it. Kings who came from distant tribes would mint coins that looked remarkably Roman. They would adopt Roman titles, speak Latin in their courts, and surround themselves with scholars who carefully preserved ancient Roman books and knowledge. It was as if they understood that Rome represented something more powerful than just political control. It represented a way of organizing the world that had proven its worth over centuries. The roads that Roman engineers had built still connected cities across Europe. Travelers could walk on stones laid by hands that had been dust for generations. The language of law and administration remained Latin in most places. Churches continued to spread the Christian faith that Rome had eventually embraced. In courtrooms and monasteries, in royal halls and village squares, the echoes of Roman civilization continued to resonate. But change was everywhere too. The unified administration that had once governed this vast territory with remarkable efficiency had broken apart. Borders became fluid, things shifting with the fortunes of war and diplomacy. Trade routes that had once been secure became dangerous passages. Cities that had thrived under imperial protection began to shrink. Those grand public buildings, the baths where citizens had gathered, the theatres where they had been entertained, the great arenas where gladiators had fought, many of these fell silent. For ordinary people, this transformation brought a mixture of hardship and relief. Some found that their tax burdens became lighter, without the elaborate imperial bureaucracy demanding tribute. Others discovered new forms of exploitation under rulers who were still learning how to govern. Farmers continued to work the same fields their ancestors had tended, but the world around those fields was shifting in ways both subtle and dramatic. Meanwhile, far to the east, in the great city of Constantinople, another story was unfolding. Here, the Roman Empire had not fallen at all. Under Emperor Anastasius, this eastern realm was actually growing stronger. The wealth of its provinces remained intact. Its capital stood protected by water and walls, and its armies held firm against threats that had overwhelmed the West. This Eastern Empire, which we call Byzantine, preserved much of what Rome had been while adapting to new realities. Its emperors still claimed the title of Roman Caesar. Its citizens considered themselves Romans, even as their world evolved in distinctly different directions. They spoke Greek more often than Latin, developed new forms of art and architecture, and faced challenges that would have been foreign to the Romans of earlier centuries. The survival of the East while the West transformed reveals something important about how civilizations endure. Geography mattered enormously. Geography mattered enormously. The eastern provinces were simply wealthier, their cities more defensible, their positions less exposed to the migrations of people seeking new homes. But wealth and geography alone don't explain everything. There's something almost magical about how ideas and institutions can outlive the political structures that created them. Long after the last Western Roman emperor had been deposed, people continued to live by Roman law. They continued to speak Latin in formal settings, to build in styles that echoed Roman architecture, to organize their societies according to principles that Roman thinkers had developed. Christianity played a crucial role in this continuity. As Rome's final official religion, it provided a unifying force that transcended political boundaries. A Visigothic king in Spain and a Frankish ruler in Gaul might compete for territory, but they could share the same faith, the same calendar of holy days, the same fundamental beliefs about how society should be organized. The transformation wasn't uniform across all the former Western territories. In some regions, the change was dramatic and swift. In others, life continued much as it had for generations. A farmer in Gaul might notice that tax collectors now served a Frankish king rather than a Roman emperor, that his daily routines, his seasonal celebrations, his family customs might remain largely unchanged. Urban life tells perhaps the most visible story of transformation. Cities that had once bustled with commerce and culture became quieter, smaller places. The great public spaces that had defined Roman civic life were repurposed or abandoned. Markets shrank, populations declined, and the elaborate entertainments that had once drawn crowds from across the empire became memories. Yet even this decline wasn't simply destruction. It represented adaptation to new circumstances. Without the vast trade networks that had supported large urban populations, cities naturally contracted to sustainable sizes. Without the imperial administration that had required massive bureaucracies, public buildings were no longer needed for their original purposes. This process of change and continuity would continue for centuries. Medieval Europe was being born from the transformation of the Roman world, inheriting its legal traditions, its religious framework, its architectural knowledge, and its literary heritage. Even as new languages evolved from Latin, new forms of government emerged from Roman precedents, and new artistic styles grew from Roman foundations. The power of Rome had always extended far beyond its armies and tax collectors. It lived in the minds of people who had learned to think of themselves as civilized, who valued education and law, who believed in the possibility of organizing human society according to rational principles. These ideas proved more durable than any political institution. And so, as night fell over that eternal city, as lamps flickered to life in windows where families gathered after their daily work, the story of Rome's fall revealed itself to be something more complex and hopeful than simple destruction. It was a story of transformation, of adaptation, of the remarkable ability of human civilization to reinvent itself while preserving its most valuable achievements. The immediate drama of the Western Empire's end had concluded, but the deeper story of its influence was just beginning a new chapter. Picture yourself stepping into a world where time seems to bend, where ancient traditions refuse to die. In the early 6th century, while Western Europe struggles through what many call the Dark Ages, one city blazes like a beacon across the eastern Mediterranean. Constantinople stands proud, its walls reaching toward heaven, its harbors bustling with ships from distant lands. This isn't just any city, mind you. This is the beating heart of an empire that refuses to admit defeat. The Eastern Roman Empire, what scholars would later call Byzantine, stretches across vast territories, from the Balkans to Egypt, from the Black Sea to the deserts of Arabia. Now imagine walking through these streets in the year 527. The air buzzes with anticipation, because something momentous is happening. An old emperor, Justin I, has grown frail and tired. But before death claims him, he makes a decision that will echo through the centuries. He chooses his nephew, a man named Justinian, to carry the imperial burden. Within months, Justin passes into history, and suddenly Justinian finds himself holding the reins of an empire. But this isn't just any ordinary succession. This man harbors dreams so grand, so audacious, that they seem almost impossible. As you wander the bustling marketplaces, you notice something fascinating. Latin echoes through the administrative buildings, while Greek flows like music through everyday conversations. The empire lives in two languages, two cultures blending like watercolors on wet paper. Officials wear their traditional robes with pride. Ceremonies unfold according to rituals older than memory itself. The people here don't think of themselves as something new or different. In their minds, they are Romans, pure and simple. The Western territories lost to barbarian tribes aren't truly gone, just temporarily misplaced. It's a beautiful delusion, really, this belief that Rome's glory can be restored, that scattered pieces can be gathered up again. In the great palace complex where marble columns reach toward painted ceilings, you encounter two of history's most remarkable figures. Justinian himself cuts an interesting silhouette, not tall, not particularly handsome, but his eyes burn with intelligence and calculation. There's something magnetic about his presence, a quiet intensity that draws people in. Beside him stands Theodora, and oh, what a story she represents. Born into poverty, raised in Constantinople's rougher neighborhoods, she somehow climbed the social ladder rung by impossible rung. Some whisper she once worked as an actress, others hint at darker chapters in her past. But here she stands, crowned empress, wielding power that would make seasoned politicians weep with envy. Palace insiders speak in hushed tones about her influence. She doesn't just whisper sweet nothings in the emperor's ear. She shapes policy, commands loyalty, builds networks that stretch across the empire like invisible webs. Some say she possesses a will stronger than steel, a mind sharper than any blade in the imperial armory. Justinian's dreams, though, that's where this story becomes truly fascinating. Previous Eastern emperors had accepted reality, made peace with loss. They focused on defending what remained, building walls instead of bridges, choosing survival over glory. But Justinian sees the world differently. He looks westward toward Italy, toward Africa, toward lands now ruled by Gothic kings and Vandal princes, and he sees theft pure and simple. In his mind, these barbarian kingdoms represent nothing more than elaborate criminal enterprises. They've stolen Roman territory, usurped Roman authority, broken Roman law, and thieves, well, thieves eventually face justice. The emperor begins planning something unprecedented, a campaign to reclaim the West, to reunite the empire under one crown, one law, one faith. Timing, as they say, is everything. Intelligence reports flow into Constantinople describing chaos beyond the borders. The Vandal kingdom in Africa tears itself apart over succession disputes. Brothers fight brothers, generals switch sides, like weather vanes in a storm. Meanwhile, in Italy, the great Gothic king Theodoric has died, leaving behind a power vacuum that draws ambitious men like honey draws flies. Justinian studies these reports like a chess master examining the board. Opportunities present themselves, but opportunities he knows rarely last forever. The window for action might close at any moment, but before any grand military adventures can begin, Constantinople itself explodes into chaos. January 532 brings with it one of history's strangest revolutions. It starts, believe it or not, with sports. Chariot racing, to be precise. Two factions, the Blues and the Greens, have dominated Constantinople's social scene for generations. Think of them as ancient, political parties, mixed with football clubs, with a dash of street gang thrown in for good measure. What begins as typical post-race tensions escalates beyond anyone's wildest imagination. The Blues and Greens, eternal rivals, suddenly unite against imperial authority. They storm through the streets, setting fires, breaking windows, demanding change. For 5 terrifying days, revolution stalks the imperial capital. You can almost smell the smoke, hear the shouting crowds, feel the tremor of uncertainty that shakes the palace walls. Justinian, this man with such grand dreams, finds himself trapped in his own home, watching flames devour his city. Advisors whisper about escape routes, about boats waiting in hidden harbors, about the wisdom of strategic retreat. And then, in this moment of absolute crisis, Theodora steps forward. History remembers her words, spoken like poetry in the face of disaster. Purple, she declares, makes a fine burial shroud. Better to die wearing the crown than live as a beggar in exile. It's a speech that changes everything, that transforms fear into resolve, retreat into attack. Justinian summons Belisarius, his most trusted general, and issues orders that will haunt Constantinople's memory for centuries. The general leads loyal troops into the Hippodrome, where rebel leaders have gathered with their followers. What happens next isn't pretty. Swords, flash, blood flows, and when silence finally returns, tens of thousands lie dead. The Nika Revolt, as history names it, ends in massacre. But from this destruction, Justinian draws inspiration for creation. He looks at the burned buildings, the damaged monuments, the scarred neighborhoods, and sees opportunity. Constantinople will rise again, but this time, it will rise greater than ever before. The emperor commissions architects to design something unprecedented. A cathedral that will dwarf every previous achievement. a building that will speak to future generations about imperial power and divine favor. They call it Hagia Sophia, Holy Wisdom, and watching it take shape becomes one of the great spectacles of the age. For 5 years, armies of workers labor under the Byzantine sun. Engineers solve problems that seem impossible, creating solutions that defy conventional wisdom. The Great Dome rises like a miracle, appearing to float without adequate support, challenging every assumption about what stone and mortar can achieve. When completed in 537, Hagia Sophia stands as more than just a building. It embodies Justinian's vision, made manifest in marble and gold, a perfect fusion of earthly ambition and heavenly aspiration. Visitors stand beneath that impossible dome, craning their necks upward, feeling simultaneously humbled and elevated. This cathedral becomes Constantinople's crown jewel. But more than that, it serves as a promise that Roman greatness hasn't died, that imperial dreams can still reshape reality, that one man's vision supported by one woman's courage can literally move mountains of stone into patterns that inspire awe. The stage is now set for everything that follows, for campaigns that will stretch across 3 continents, for victories and defeats that will reshape the Mediterranean world, for a reign that history will remember as both magnificent and tragic, ambitious beyond measure, and limited by the very human frailties of those who dare to dream too large. Picture Constantinople in the 6th century, where an emperor named Justinian dreams of something magnificent. He wants to build a cathedral so extraordinary that it would make even the legendary King Solomon envious. This isn't just any ordinary church, mind you. It's going to be a masterpiece that blends the best of 3 worlds. The Romans, you see, were masters of engineering. They knew how to make buildings that could stand for centuries, with their clever use of concrete and ingenious structural techniques. The Greeks, on the other hand, had this incredible eye for beauty. They understood proportions and aesthetics in ways that still take our breath away today. And then there was this new force in the world, Christianity, with its rich symbolism and spiritual meaning. When Justinian finally walked into his completed cathedral, legend says he couldn't help but boast a little. He supposedly declared that he had outdone Solomon himself. It's the kind of moment that makes you wonder about the sheer ambition of these ancient rulers, isn't it? But here's something fascinating. While grand buildings certainly make for impressive legacies, Justinian was working on something even more lasting during those same years. He was tackling one of the most complex puzzles any ruler had ever faced: the mess of Roman law. Imagine trying to organize centuries' worth of legal decisions, imperial commands, and court rulings. It would be like trying to sort through a massive library where nothing was properly catalogued, and half the books contradicted the other half. Roman law had been accumulating for generations, layer upon layer, until it became almost impossible to navigate. Justinian threw himself into this project with remarkable dedication. Officials who worked with him described how he would personally review sections of legal code, spending hours debating with scholars about the finer points of justice. He had this belief, quite philosophical really, that civilization itself depended on having clear, consistent laws. The result of all this work became known as the Corpus Juris, or body of civil law. It's one of those historical achievements that quietly shaped the world for over 1,000 years. European legal systems would draw from this foundation long after Justinian's empire had faded into memory. While these domestic projects were keeping him busy, Justinian's mind kept wandering to an even grander vision. He dreamed of reconquest, of bringing back the glory days when Roman power stretched across the Mediterranean. It's the kind of dream that has captivated rulers throughout history, this idea of restoring a golden age. His first target was North Africa, specifically the Vandals' kingdom. Now, the Vandals had controlled this region for about a century by this point. It had once been Rome's breadbasket, one of those territories that kept the empire fed and wealthy. Even under Vandal rule, it remained prosperous and strategically important. The timing, as they say, was everything. In 533, the Vandal king Gelimer found himself dealing with a rebellion in Sardinia. It's funny how these historical moments turn on such coincidences, isn't it? While Gelimer was distracted, Justinian saw his opportunity and seized it. The force Justinian sent wasn't massive by the standards of the day, just about 15,000 men. He placed them under the command of Belisarius, one of those generals who seems to have stepped right out of legend. This was quite a gamble, considering that a much larger Roman expedition had failed catastrophically just decades earlier in 468. But Belisarius was a different kind of commander. When the Byzantine forces landed near Carthage, they encountered surprisingly little resistance. Unlike that earlier failed expedition, this campaign was marked by careful planning and intelligence gathering. Belisarius maintained strict discipline among his troops, but perhaps more importantly, he understood the psychology of conquest. Instead of presenting himself as a foreign invader, Belisarius positioned his mission as liberation. He cultivated friendly relationships with the local Roman population, many of whom still remembered when their ancestors had been part of the empire. It's a reminder of how conquest isn't just about military might, it's often about winning hearts and minds. The campaign unfolded with almost storybook efficiency. 2 decisive battles, one at Decimum and another at Tricomarum, saw Belisarius defeat the Vandal forces and capture King Gelimer himself. By March of 534, less than a year after it had begun, the entire Vandal kingdom had been absorbed back into the empire. When Belisarius returned to Constantinople, his triumph was the stuff of legend. He brought with him the captured Vandal king and the treasures of Carthage. But among those treasures was something particularly symbolic: the sacred vessels from Jerusalem's temple. These vessels had quite a journey through history. The Romans had originally seized them when they destroyed the temple in 70 AD. They brought these holy relics back to Rome as trophies. Then, when the Vandals sacked Rome in 455, they carried off these same vessels to North Africa. Now, almost 80 years later, they were returning to imperial possession once again. For Justinian and his supporters, this felt like divine confirmation that their cause was just. It's remarkable how objects can carry such symbolic weight, isn't it? These vessels had witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms, the ebb and flow of empires, and now they seemed to herald a new chapter in the long story of Roman power. The speed of this conquest amazed contemporaries. What had seemed impossible for generations had been accomplished in mere months. It was the kind of victory that makes rulers believe they can reshape the world according to their vision. The death of Theodoric the Great in 526 created ripples across the Mediterranean world that would change everything. Picture Italy in those days, a land caught between its glorious past and an uncertain future. Theodoric had been a steady hand, keeping the old Roman traditions alive while ruling through Gothic strength. But when powerful leaders die, their kingdoms often crumble like ancient walls, finally giving way to time. His grandson Athalaric took the throne, but youth and inexperience made poor companions for a crown. The boy died young, leaving behind a power vacuum that ambitious relatives rushed to fill. His mother, Amalasuntha, tried to hold things together as regent, but family politics can be more deadly than any battlefield. When her own cousin Theodahad had her murdered in 500 and 535, he handed Justinian the perfect excuse to act. The emperor had been watching these events unfold from Constantinople, like a chess player studying his opponent's moves. Success in North Africa had filled his treasury and boosted his confidence. Italy looked ripe for the taking, fractured by succession disputes and internal strife. The dream of restoring the old Roman Empire suddenly seemed within reach. Belisarius landed in Sicily that same year with a relatively small force. But sometimes timing matters more than numbers. The island fell quickly, almost surprisingly so. Word spread that the Byzantines had come not as conquerors, but as liberators, promising to restore legitimate Roman rule after decades of barbarian kings. The mainland campaign began with similar success. Naples opened its gates. Rome welcomed the Byzantine troops like long-lost relatives returning home. By December 536, imperial banners flew once again over the Seven Hills. Citizens lined the streets, many genuinely believing they were witnessing the return of their rightful rulers. The Gothic kingdom seemed to be collapsing as quickly as the Vandals had in Africa, but Italy would prove far different from the swift North African campaign. The Ostrogoths weren't ready to simply fade into history. They found new leadership in Totila, a man whose military skills matched his determination to keep Gothic rule alive. What began as a triumphant restoration quickly turned into something much darker, a grinding war that would drag on for nearly 2 decades. The fighting moved back and forth across the peninsula, like some terrible tide. Cities changed hands repeatedly, their populations caught in the middle of this endless struggle. Rome itself, the eternal city, became a prize to be won and lost and won again. At one point, it was almost completely abandoned, its streets echoing empty, except for the wind through broken buildings. The countryside suffered even worse than the cities. Farmers abandoned their fields rather than watch their harvests feed whichever army happened to control their region that season. Ancient infrastructure, those marvels of Roman engineering that had lasted centuries, crumbled under the strain of constant warfare. Aqueducts that had carried fresh water since Caesar's time were cut or damaged. Roads that had connected the empire fell into disrepair. Meanwhile, back in Constantinople, Justinian grew increasingly concerned with matters of faith. The emperor believed that religious unity was just as important as territorial conquest, maybe more so, but the Christian world was fractured into competing factions, each convinced they alone possessed the truth. Egypt and Syria were particularly resistant to imperial attempts at religious reconciliation. The emperor spent countless hours in theological discussions, trying to find compromises that might bring his diverse subjects together under one doctrinal umbrella. Court theologians debated fine points of Christian belief, while armies fought and died in distant Italy. Faith and politics intertwined in ways that made both more complicated. By 552, Byzantine general Narses finally managed to break Ostrogothic resistance. At the Battle of Taginae, Totile died in the fighting, and with him died the last real hope of Gothic revival. But victory came at a price that made many question whether it had been worth paying. Italy lay in ruins, its population scattered or dead, its economy shattered. The peninsula was now firmly under imperial control. But controlling a wasteland isn't quite the same as ruling a prosperous province. Ancient cities that had flourished for centuries were reduced to shadows of their former selves. The damage went far beyond what any reconstruction program could hope to repair. Still, Justinian pressed on with his vision. In 554, Byzantine forces secured portions of southern Spain from the Visigothic kingdom. Along with Sicily, Sardinia, and the Balearic Islands, this gave the emperor control over much of the Mediterranean's coastline. On maps it looked impressively similar to the old Roman Empire at its height. But maps can be deceiving. The newly reconquered territories remained unstable, their populations exhausted by decades of warfare. The imperial treasury was nearly empty, drained by the cost of constant military campaigns. The army was stretched thin across vast distances, trying to hold on to gains that seemed to require endless vigilance. When Justinian died in 565, after 38 years on the throne, he left behind a complex legacy. His territorial achievements were undeniable. The Mediterranean was once again largely under Roman rule, but the empire was financially exhausted and militarily overextended. New threats were already gathering on the horizon. The Lombards were moving toward Italy, eyeing the war-weakened peninsula with hungry eyes. To the east, the Persian Sassanid Empire remained a constant source of pressure and expense, and from the Arabian deserts, a new force was stirring that would soon reshape the entire Mediterranean world in ways no one could have imagined. Islam would burst onto the scene like lightning, conquering with a speed that made even Belisarius's African campaign look slow. Within a century of Justinian's death, much of what he had fought so hard to restore would be lost again. Egypt, Syria, North Africa, eventually even much of Italy would slip beyond imperial control. Yet some legacies proved more durable than territorial conquest. Justinian's legal code would influence law for centuries to come. His architectural projects, especially the magnificent Hagia Sophia, would inspire builders and believers long after his empire had faded. Sometimes the things we create to last forever disappear quickly, while the things we build for the moment endure through the ages. The story of how one faith managed to weave itself into the very fabric of an empire is quite remarkable. Really. Christianity started as something completely outside the Roman world, a small group of believers who faced terrible persecution for their beliefs. But by the 4th century, everything had changed completely. Emperor Theodosius made a decision that would echo through history for centuries to come. He declared Christianity the official religion of the entire Roman Empire. Just think about that for a moment. How a faith that had once been hunted down by Roman soldiers was now protected and promoted by the very same imperial system. When the western parts of the empire began to crumble in the 5th century, something fascinating happened. The bishops, these religious leaders, found themselves stepping into roles they had never expected to fill. They became the people who kept cities running, who settled disputes, who made sure the poor were fed and cared for. In Rome itself, the bishop was starting to be called something new, Papa, which simply means father. This figure, who we now call the Pope, was becoming more important than almost anyone else in the city. There's this incredible moment in 452 when Pope Leo meets with Attila the Hun, and somehow, through negotiation and persuasion, manages to convince him not to destroy Rome completely. Then there's Pope Gregory, who served from 590 to 604, and he really understood how to build something lasting. He strengthened the way the church was organized, sent missionaries to distant lands, and created a system that could survive even when kingdoms rose and fell around it. The relationship between these new barbarian kings and the Christian church was, well, it was complicated. The Franks, under their king Clovis, decided to convert to the same type of Christianity that most Romans practiced. This was actually quite clever politics, because it meant their Roman subjects felt more comfortable with their new rulers. But other groups, like the Visigoths and Ostrogoths, they followed a different version of Christianity called Arianism. This created some interesting tensions. Theodoric, the Ostrogothic king who ruled Italy, was surprisingly tolerant about religious differences. He seemed to understand that forcing people to change their beliefs rarely worked well. The Vandals in North Africa, though, they took a much harsher approach. They actively persecuted Catholics, exiled bishops who wouldn't submit to their authority, and created real suffering for people whose only crime was believing differently than their rulers. Through all of these political upheavals, something beautiful was happening in quiet corners of the former empire. Monasticism, the practice of dedicating your entire life to prayer and learning, was taking root and growing. Around 529, a man named Benedict of Nursia established a monastery at Monte Cassino. He created what became known as the Benedictine Rule, a way of organizing monastic life that balanced spiritual devotion with practical work and intellectual pursuit. These monks weren't just praying all day. They were copying manuscripts, preserving ancient texts, keeping knowledge alive, when the world around them seemed to be forgetting everything. Picture these monasteries scattered across the landscape, each one like a small island of learning and culture. In their scriptoriums, monks would spend hours carefully copying text by hand. They preserved not just Christian writings, but also the works of classical authors like Virgil and Cicero. They understood that all knowledge, even from pagan sources, could help people better understand the world they lived in. The way Christianity preserved Roman culture was really quite sophisticated. It wasn't just about keeping old books safe, it was about transforming Roman institutions and practices to serve new purposes. Ancient temples were converted into churches, but they kept their role as community gathering places. Roman festivals were given new Christian meanings. but people could still celebrate and come together. The administrative divisions that Rome had used to govern its territories became the basis for organizing the church's hierarchy. A Roman province might become an ecclesiastical diocese, with a bishop taking on some of the roles that a Roman governor had once filled. In the eastern part of the empire, where cities remained stronger and more prosperous, education took on a different character. In Constantinople, schools continued teaching classical Greek literature alongside Christian theology. Students could still learn about Homer and Plato, while also studying scripture and church doctrine. This preservation of learning wasn't happening by accident. There was a real understanding among educated Christians that the wisdom of the past was valuable, even if it came from non-Christian sources. They saw themselves as stewards of human knowledge, responsible for passing it on to future generations. By the end of the 6th century, Christianity had become something quite different from what it had been 3 centuries earlier. It had absorbed Roman organizational skills, Roman legal thinking, Roman architectural styles, and Roman approaches to education and administration. But it also transformed all of these things, giving them new purposes and new meanings. The result was something entirely new in human history, a religious institution that could function as a government, a school, a welfare system, and a cultural preservatory all at the same time. It was flexible enough to work with barbarian kings, sophisticated enough to maintain international connections, and dedicated enough to keep ancient wisdom alive through some of the darkest periods in European history. As the great Roman Empire slowly dissolved into memory, something fascinating happened. The world didn't simply collapse into darkness. Instead, it transformed, like a river breaking into countless smaller streams, each flowing in its own direction. Picture the Mediterranean in this strange new era. Where once a single emperor's word could travel from Britain to Egypt, now dozens of different rulers held sway. The Byzantine Empire, glittering and sophisticated, controlled the eastern shores. Meanwhile, Germanic kingdoms carved up the west, like pieces of an enormous puzzle. The most remarkable thing about this fractured world was how it held together, even as it fell apart. Latin still echoed through Western courts and churches, while Greek remained the language of learning in the East. Christianity wove invisible threads between distant lands, though even the faithful were beginning to argue about doctrine. Trade routes, those ancient arteries of commerce, kept pumping life through the empire's former body. Merchants still sailed familiar seas, though their journeys had become more dangerous, more uncertain. Cities shrank like flowers in winter, but they didn't disappear entirely. In Constantinople, in Rome, in smaller settlements scattered across the Mediterranean, urban life persisted with quiet determination. The idea of universal empire, that grand Roman dream, had shattered completely. Yet from its fragments emerged something oddly complex. Byzantine emperors still claimed to rule the world, even though their actual power reached only so far. Germanic kings ruled as they pleased. But sometimes they bow politely toward distant Constantinople, acknowledging traditions they didn't quite understand. Perhaps most intriguingly, the church began to fill the void left by imperial authority. The Pope in Rome started speaking with a voice that crossed all borders, claiming spiritual dominion over souls that no earthly king could touch. Each region began writing its own story from the same shared past. The Byzantine East clung most tightly to Roman traditions. Their cities hummed with commerce and scholarship. Their bureaucrats still kept meticulous records. Their emperor still wore purple, still claimed divine favor. North Africa told a different tale. Justinian had reconquered it for Rome, bringing back imperial eagles to ancient Carthage. But change was coming from the desert, carried by Arab armies who would soon paint the entire region with the colors of Islam. Italy suffered perhaps the most. The Gothic War had left cities in ruins, countryside depopulated. Then came the Lombards, adding fresh chaos to an already wounded land. Yet Roman culture survived in unexpected places, preserved most carefully by Christian monks and bishops who saw themselves as guardians of ancient wisdom. In Gaul, the Franks created something entirely new. They took Roman law and Germanic customs mixed them like ingredients in some grand experiment. The result was a civilization that was neither fully Roman nor Germanic, but something uniquely its own. Spain's Visigothic kingdom achieved perhaps the most elegant synthesis. Roman traditions and Germanic vigor blended smoothly, creating a sophisticated culture that might have flourished for centuries. But Islamic armies were already gathering across the narrow strait, preparing to write a completely different chapter. Britain followed the most isolated path. When Roman legions departed in the early 400s, they left behind roads, walls, and scattered Romano-British communities. Anglo-Saxon settlers gradually claimed the land, bringing their own languages, customs, and gods. For a time, Britain seemed lost to the Roman world entirely, but Christianity would eventually return, carried by missionaries who remembered when all roads led to Rome. What emerges from this fragmented landscape is a truth both simple and profound. Empires may fall, but civilizations adapt, survive, transform. The Roman Empire died, yes, but Roman ideas lived on in countless forms, some barely recognizable, others surprisingly faithful to their origins. In Byzantine courts, in Frankish councils, in Irish monasteries, in Spanish cathedrals, the ghost of Rome continued to whisper. Sometimes in Latin, sometimes in Greek, sometimes in languages Rome never knew, but always carrying forward something essential, something that refused to die with the eagles and the purple. This wasn't really an ending at all. It was a beginning, strange and uncertain, but full of possibility. The story of Rome's transformation, well, it's nothing like what you might expect from the history books. Picture yourself wandering through the streets of a city that was once the center of the world, now quieter, different, but still breathing with life. You see, when people talk about the fall of Rome, they paint this picture of sudden collapse, of barbarians storming through gates, of civilization crumbling overnight. But that's not really how it happened at all. Think of it more like watching a river change its course, slowly, gradually, finding new paths while still flowing toward the same sea. The Colosseum still stood there, massive and imposing, but the roar of crowds had faded into memory. No more gladiators, no more wild beasts, just silence, and the whisper of wind through empty arches. Yet somehow, this silence wasn't sad, it was peaceful, like an old theater after the final curtain call. Down in the Forum, where senators once debated the fate of nations, grass grew between ancient stones. Nature was gently reclaiming what humans had built, but people still walked these paths, still conducted business, still lived their lives. They just did it differently now, with new customs blending into old traditions. The Pantheon tells perhaps the most beautiful story of all. This temple, once dedicated to every god the Romans could imagine, had become a Christian church. Same building, same soaring dome, same sense of the divine, but serving a different faith. Nobody tore it down. Nobody declared the old ways evil. They simply, quietly, transformed it. And this transformation, this gentle reshaping, was happening everywhere. Roman law, that magnificent system of justice that had governed an empire, didn't disappear when the last emperor handed over his crown. Clever minds preserved it, adapted it, wove it into new legal traditions. Justinian's codification would influence courts and kingdoms for 1,000 years to come. The administrative genius of Rome, those intricate systems of governance that had held together such a vast territory, found new life in unexpected places. The Christian Church adopted many of these practices, creating a spiritual empire with earthly efficiency. Germanic kingdoms took Roman bureaucratic methods and made them their own. In monasteries scattered across the former empire, monks carefully copied Roman texts, preserving literature and learning in scriptoriums lit by candlelight. These weren't just religious men, they were guardians of civilization, keeping alive the wisdom of Cicero, Virgil, and countless others. Centuries later, Renaissance scholars would rediscover these treasures and marvel at their beauty. But perhaps the most fascinating thing was how the idea of Rome itself refused to die. Long after the political reality had vanished, rulers across Europe claimed to be Rome's true heirs. Charlemagne called himself Roman Emperor. The Byzantines insisted they were the real Romans. Otto the Great revived the title in Germany. It was as if Rome had become something magical, something eternal that transcended borders and armies. The Eternal City, they called it, and somehow in ways both mysterious and practical, it truly was eternal. Walking through Ravenna in those twilight years of the 6th century, you could see all these layers of history existing together. Byzantine officials conducted business in buildings constructed by Gothic kings who had themselves adapted Roman architectural styles. Christian priests celebrated Mass in churches that incorporated pagan artistic elements. This wasn't chaos, it was evolution. Think of how a forest changes through seasons and years, how old trees fall and become soil for new growth, how different species adapt and find their niches. European civilization was growing from Roman roots, but it was becoming something new, something that drew strength from multiple sources. The engineering marvels Romans had pioneered, their aqueducts and roads and amphitheaters continued to inspire builders for generations. Even when people forgot exactly how certain techniques worked, they remembered that such things were possible, and that memory drove them to innovate and improve. As evening settled over the 7 hills of Rome, casting long shadows across a landscape where past and present mingled freely, you could almost see the ghostly outlines of all Rome's different incarnations. The proud republic of ancient days, the mighty empire at its peak, Constantine's Christian capital, Theodoric's Gothic kingdom, Justinian's reconquered territory. Each version had left its mark, contributed its own thread to the tapestry. Nothing was ever completely lost. Nothing was ever completely preserved. Everything flowed and changed and adapted, like that river we imagined earlier, always moving, but somehow always itself. The stars appeared slowly in the darkening sky. Those same stars that had watched over Roman legions and Gothic warriors, over Christian martyrs and Byzantine merchants. Empires rise and fall, yes, but their influence spreads like ripples on water, touching shores they never directly reached, shaping futures they never imagined. Historical change, real change, happens slowly and subtly. Old patterns persist in unexpected ways, while new ones emerge from surprising sources. The Roman story reminds us that civilization isn't fragile, it's adaptable. It bends without breaking, transforms without disappearing, survives by becoming something new while honoring something old. Picture yourself walking through the evening streets of an ancient city, where flickering lanterns cast dancing shadows across walls covered in magnificent mosaics. Golden tesserae catch the light, creating images of emperors and saints that seem almost alive in the warm glow. These aren't just decorations, they're windows into a world where Roman tradition, Christian faith, and Germanic power all swirl together, like colors on an artist's palette. You know, there's something almost poetic about how Rome created the very forces that would eventually challenge it. Imagine a master craftsman teaching his apprentice every secret technique, only to watch that apprentice eventually compete with him. For centuries, Roman merchants carried their goods beyond the empire's borders, their coins jingling in foreign purses. Roman diplomats spoke with tribal leaders, sharing ideas about governance and military strategy. Roman soldiers demonstrated their famous tactics to allies and enemies alike. All this contact, all this exchange, it was like seeds scattered on fertile ground. Germanic tribes that had once been scattered groups of farmers and warriors began to think bigger, dream larger. They watched how Romans organized their armies, how they made decisions as unified groups rather than loose collections of families. A Gothic elder might tell you that Rome was the greatest teacher these tribes ever had, showing them not just how to fight, but how to think like an empire. The Goths learned to form larger confederations, bringing together tribes that had once feuded with each other. They developed more sophisticated leadership, men who could speak Latin as fluently as their own tongue. These weren't the wild barbarians that Roman writers loved to describe in their histories, all fur and fury and mindless rage. These were complex societies with their own poets and laws, their own dreams of glory and security. It's fascinating how contact with civilization doesn't always mean becoming peaceful. Sometimes it means becoming more dangerous in entirely new ways. These Germanic groups absorbed Roman military techniques, like sponges absorbing water. They learned to plan campaigns that stretched across seasons, to coordinate attacks across vast distances, to use Roman siege engines against Roman walls. Leaders like Alaric emerged from this transformation, men who understood both worlds completely. They could negotiate with senators in perfect Latin, then turn around and inspire their warriors with ancient battle songs. They didn't necessarily want to destroy Rome, they wanted to join it, to carve out their own piece of that glittering prize that dominated their world. But sometimes history throws a wild card into the mix, something nobody sees coming. In this case, it was the Huns, sweeping out of the Central Asian steppes, like a storm wind that changes everything in its path. Picture these nomadic warriors, masters of the horse and bow, appearing on the horizon of Germanic settlements that had grown comfortable in their relationship with Rome. The Huns were different from anything Europe had seen before. They weren't interested in settling down, in learning Latin, in finding their place within the Roman system. They were pure kinetic energy, a military force that could strike anywhere and disappear like smoke. Under their legendary leader, Attila, they became something like a natural disaster with intelligence and ambition. When the Huns pressed westward, they didn't just conquer territories, they set entire populations in motion. Gothic tribes that had been Rome's sometimes allies, sometimes enemies, suddenly found themselves homeless refugees streaming toward Roman borders. It was like watching dominoes fall, each pushed by the one behind it, in an endless chain reaction that nobody could stop. The year 376 becomes a turning point in this story, when desperate Gothic families appeared at the Danube River, asking Rome for sanctuary. These weren't invaders exactly. They were people fleeing from something even more frightening than the prospect of Roman rule. But fear makes people unpredictable, and desperation can turn grateful refugees into dangerous enemies faster than you might expect. What followed was the kind of military disaster that changes the course of history. At Adrianople, Roman legions that had seemed invincible for centuries met their match against warriors who fought with nothing left to lose. An emperor died on that battlefield, and with him died something intangible but precious, the sense that Rome was untouchable, eternal, destined to rule forever. Even after Attila's death broke Hunnic power into fragments, the damage was done. Populations had been shuffled like cards, old relationships between Rome and its neighbors had been shattered, and new realities had taken root across the European landscape. You can't put spilled water back into the pitcher, and you can't reverse the kind of demographic upheaval that the Hunnic invasions had triggered. But here's the thing about Rome that makes its story so compelling. It had survived external pressures before. Celtic tribes, Germanic invasions, Persian armies, civil wars, plagues, economic collapses. Rome had weathered them all like a sturdy ship, riding out storm after storm. The empire had this remarkable ability to bend without breaking, to absorb enemies and turn them into allies, to rebuild from disasters that would have crushed lesser civilizations. So why was this time different? Why couldn't Rome's legendary resilience carry it through one more crisis? The answer lies not just in what was happening outside the empire's borders, but in what was changing within them. In the slow erosion of the very capabilities that had made Rome great in the first place. Picture Rome in its final centuries, and you might imagine gleaming legions marching in perfect formation. But by then, the reality looked quite different. The empire had been transforming its military for hundreds of years, slowly, almost without anyone noticing. In the beginning, Roman armies were made up of citizens, farmers who left their plows to pick up swords when duty called. These were the legendary legions of the Republic, men fighting for their homeland. But as Rome grew massive, stretching across continents, this system simply couldn't work anymore. Professional soldiers replaced the citizen farmers. creating armies that could stay in the field year after year. Then came another shift, perhaps the most dramatic of all. The late empire developed what we might call a two-tier military system. There were frontier forces stationed along the borders like watchmen on a wall, and there were mobile field armies ready to rush wherever trouble appeared. It sounds efficient, but it came with a price that would prove devastating. Rome was running out of Romans willing to fight. Imagine being a recruitment officer in some distant Gallic town, tasked with filling the legions. The old traditions had simply faded away, like morning mist. Wealthy families had found ways to buy their sons out of military service. Who could blame them? War had become a professional affair, not a civic duty. Meanwhile, provincial landowners were hiding potential recruits, keeping them working in the fields instead. Food production mattered more than military service, at least to those who owned the land. So Rome turned to an obvious solution, one that seemed brilliant at the time. They recruited barbarians. These weren't random raiders or desperate refugees. Many were skilled warriors from tribes beyond the borders, men who saw Roman military service as an opportunity for advancement. Some joined as individuals, working their way up through the ranks. Others came as entire units, called foederati, serving under their own traditional leaders but fighting for Roman pay. The system worked for a while. Barbarian soldiers often proved excellent fighters, bringing different tactics and fresh energy to Roman armies. They earned steady wages, gained Roman citizenship, and found paths to prosperity that didn't exist in their homeland. From Rome's perspective, it solved the recruitment problem without forcing unwilling citizens into service. But this solution carried hidden dangers, like a beautiful flower with poisonous roots. These barbarian soldiers had divided loyalties, torn between their new Roman commanders and their ancestral tribes. When conflicts arose, which side would they choose? This military transformation might have remained manageable if Rome had kept its wealth. But the empire was slowly bleeding gold and silver, losing the provinces that had once filled its treasury. In 439, the Vandals took control of North Africa, one of Rome's richest territories. This wasn't just a military defeat, it was financial catastrophe. North Africa had been like a golden goose for the Western Empire, providing grain and tax revenue in enormous quantities. Losing it created what we might call a death spiral. Less money meant weaker armies meant losing more territory, and losing territory meant even less money. Each loss made the next one more likely. Picture the imperial court trying to balance impossible budgets, forced to choose between paying soldiers and maintaining roads, between defending one province and abandoning another. These weren't abstract policy decisions, they were desperate attempts to keep a crumbling system functioning. Political chaos made everything worse. The Western Empire in the 5th century resembled a theatre where the actors kept changing roles mid-performance. Emperors were assassinated, generals seized power, rivals emerged from every shadow. Civil war became almost routine, with Roman armies fighting each other instead of defending the borders. The most tragic example might be Emperor Valentinian III's decision to assassinate his own general Aetius in 454. This wasn't just any general. Aetius was arguably the Western Empire's most capable military leader. He had successfully managed barbarian relations and defended Roman territory for decades. Yet Valentinian killed him, perhaps fearing Aetius was becoming too powerful. The irony cuts deep. Attila the Hun had died just a year earlier, removing one of Rome's greatest external threats. This should have been a moment of opportunity, a chance to rebuild and strengthen the empire. Instead, Valentinian eliminated his own best general. 6 months later, Valentinian himself was assassinated, plunging the empire into yet another succession crisis. It's almost as if the Western Empire was determined to destroy itself, like a person picking at a wound until it becomes infected. Roman factions would actually ally with barbarian groups against other Romans, prioritizing domestic political struggles over external defense. Meanwhile, The Eastern Empire, centered on the magnificent city of Constantinople, faced many of the same pressures but somehow survived. The differences weren't dramatic, but they added up like coins in a savings jar. The East had more money, flowing from prosperous trade routes and productive provinces. Its geography provided better natural defenses, especially Constantinople itself, protected by water on three sides. The Eastern emperors also managed to maintain more stable succession, avoiding some of the political chaos that plagued the West. They kept tighter control over their military forces, preventing the kind of barbarian integration that had created divided loyalties elsewhere. But here's what makes this story fascinating, rather than simply sad. The fall of Rome wasn't like a building collapsing in an earthquake. It was more like a slow transformation, a gradual blending of Roman and barbarian elements that created something entirely new. The barbarian kingdoms that replaced direct Roman rule weren't foreign conquests in the traditional sense. They were hybrid creations, combining Germanic leadership with Roman administrative knowledge. A Visigothic king might rule from a Roman palace, using Roman bureaucrats to collect taxes according to Roman law. Even more remarkable, many aspects of Roman civilization outlasted the political empire itself. Latin remained the language of educated people throughout the former Western provinces. Scholars, priests, and administrators continued speaking and writing in Latin for centuries after the last Western emperor had fallen. Roman law proved even more durable than Roman armies. Legal principles developed in imperial courts continued shaping European legal systems long after the empire had vanished. The Catholic Church became, in many ways, the inheritor of Roman organizational genius, adapting imperial administrative structures for religious purposes. Roman engineering and architecture survived, too, though often on a smaller scale. Medieval builders still used Roman techniques, still marveled at Roman monuments. The very idea of Rome as a universal civilizing force remained powerful, inspiring later emperors and kingdoms to claim Roman legitimacy. Perhaps that's the real lesson here. Civilizations don't simply end, they transform, passing their knowledge and achievements to successors who reshaped them for new times and circumstances. Rome fell, but in falling, it planted seeds that would grow into medieval Europe, carrying forward the best of what had come before. The story of Rome's transformation reveals something fascinating about how power changes hands across the centuries. When we think about empires ending, we often imagine sudden, dramatic collapses, but Rome's story was far more gradual and complex than that. Picture this. For hundreds of years after Rome's supposed fall, rulers across Europe would wake up each morning and look in the mirror, trying to convince themselves they were the true heirs of Caesar. Charlemagne did this, the Byzantine emperors did this, and countless others followed suit. They all wanted that Roman legitimacy, that ancient prestige that came with claiming to be Rome's rightful successor. It's almost touching, really, how desperately these medieval kings wanted to wrap themselves in Rome's faded purple cloak. They understood something important, that Rome represented more than just political power. It was a symbol of civilization itself, of order emerging from chaos. Now here's where things get interesting. Christianity's rise happened to coincide with Rome's most vulnerable period. Emperor Theodosius made Christianity the empire's official religion in the late 4th century, right when barbarian tribes were pressing harder against Rome's borders than ever before. Some people looked at this timing and thought, well, that's obvious. Christianity must have weakened Rome somehow. Maybe it made Romans too peaceful, too focused on turning the other cheek instead of wielding the sword. Maybe all those resources going to build churches should have gone to building fortifications instead. But the reality was much more nuanced. Think about what actually happened. In those chaotic years, as Roman governors fled their posts, bishops often stepped in to fill the void. They became the ones negotiating with barbarian chieftains, organizing food distribution, maintaining some semblance of civic order. Monasteries became these remarkable institutions, preserving not just Christian texts, but classical Roman literature too. Monks copying manuscripts by candlelight were saving Virgil alongside the Gospels, keeping alive the very culture some claimed Christianity was destroying. The church's structure, ironically, was modeled partly on imperial administration. It maintained connections across territories that were becoming politically fragmented in a strange way. Christianity became Rome's most successful export, spreading far beyond where Roman legions had ever marched. There's this beautiful quote from a bishop in Gaul during this period. He said, "The empire hasn't truly fallen, it has been baptized. Christ now reigns where Caesar once ruled, and his kingdom shall have no end." This perspective saw Rome's transformation not as a catastrophe, but as part of some divine plan. Medieval writers would embrace this interpretation, weaving Rome's story into a broader narrative about God guiding human history. But what was life actually like for ordinary people living through these changes? Well, it depended entirely on where you happened to be born and when. In Britain, Roman authority vanished relatively quickly. One generation might remember Roman roads bustling with imperial messengers, while their children grew up in a world where those same roads were crumbling and overgrown. In southern Gaul or Italy, the transition was much smoother. And overgrown, in southern Gaul or Italy, Roman aristocrats often kept their villas, their social positions, their cultural practices. They just started paying taxes to Gothic or Lombard kings instead of Roman emperors. Cities generally shrank during this period. The grand public buildings that had defined Roman urban life, the baths, the theatres, the forums, these gradually fell into disrepair. Resources that once went toward monumental civic projects were redirected toward building churches and monasteries. Trade networks contracted, but never completely disappeared. Merchants still moved goods across the Mediterranean, but perhaps in smaller volumes and along more localized routes. Literacy became less common among ordinary people, but it persisted among church officials and administrative elites. The written word survived, even if fewer people could access it. Yet, amid all these changes, the fundamental rhythms of human life continued. Farmers still planted and harvested their crops. They might pay taxes to a Visigothic king rather than a Roman emperor, but the wheat grew just the same. Artisans still practiced their crafts, though their markets might be more local than before. Blacksmiths still forged tools, potters still shaped clay, weavers still worked their looms. Children were born, people fell in love and married, families celebrated and mourned. The elderly shared their wisdom with the young. These universal human experiences transcended political upheaval. There's another wonderful quote from this period, from a Roman aristocrat in southern Gaul. He explained his family's adaptation across generations. "My grandfather served in the imperial administration," he said. "My father advised the Visigothic court, and now I assist the bishop. The rulers change, but we adapt. We preserve what's valuable from the past while finding our place in the present." This pragmatic approach characterized how many Romans navigated their empire's transformation. Rather than futile resistance to inevitable change, they found creative ways to maintain their cultural identity and social position within new political frameworks. Roman senators served barbarian kings. Roman lawyers helped codify laws for Germanic rulers. Roman bishops blessed Frankish chieftains. The forms changed, but the underlying skills and knowledge persisted. When we step back and look at the bigger picture, Rome's fall represents something more like a metamorphosis than a death. The classical world didn't simply vanish overnight. It gradually transformed into the medieval world, carrying forward many elements while recombining them in new and unexpected patterns. Rome's legacy proved remarkably durable, precisely because it was adaptable. Roman ideas about law, government, architecture, literature, and religion could be adopted and modified by peoples who had never been subject to Roman rule. The empire's physical reach had limits, but its cultural influence extended far beyond its borders and long past its political existence. This is how Rome achieved a kind of immortality, not as a continuous political entity, but as a cultural template that others could reference and reimagine. For more than 1,000 years after the last Western emperor handed over his imperial regalia, European rulers would still look to Rome for models of legitimacy and authority. Renaissance scholars would rediscover classical texts with the excitement of archaeologists uncovering treasure. Modern nation-states would adopt Roman symbols for their government buildings, Roman eagles perching atop contemporary capitals. Roman architectural styles would influence everything from cart houses to universities to memorial monuments. Even today, Latin-derived words fill our everyday vocabulary. Legal concepts developed in Roman courts continue to inform our justice systems. The memory of Rome still shapes how we think about empire, civilization, and the great sweep of historical change. In the end, Rome's transformation teaches us that endings are rarely as final as they first appear, and that the most enduring legacies often survive in forms their creators never could have imagined. When we think about great civilizations, we often imagine them crashing down like mighty trees in a storm. But the truth is far more gentle, far more mysterious. Rome didn't really fall the way we might picture it. Instead, it slowly became something else, like a river that changes course over many seasons. Picture yourself walking through the streets of an ancient city, where old Roman columns hold up new buildings, where familiar traditions blend with foreign customs. This is what transformation really looks like. It's not sudden, it's not violent, it's simply the way of things. The Romans themselves would have been amazed to see what their empire became. For hundreds of years, they believed their city was eternal, their borders unbreakable. The very idea that Rome could change seemed impossible. Yet change it did, in ways both small and profound. Success, as it turns out, can be a strange teacher. Rome's influence spread so far, touched so many peoples, that those same peoples learned Roman ways of organizing armies, building governments, creating art. The student eventually became as skilled as the master. Germanic tribes, once considered barbarians, developed sophisticated military tactics. They learned diplomacy, strategy, the subtle arts of power. Sometimes we search for simple answers to complex questions. Why did Rome transform? Was it moral corruption? Was it lead in the water pipes? Was it the rise of Christianity? The real answer is more like a symphony than a single note. Many forces played together, creating harmonies and tensions that nobody could have predicted. Imagine dominoes falling, but not in a straight line. Instead, picture them scattered across a vast table, each one connected to several others. When migration pushed one group of people westward, they pressed against another group, who then pressed against Roman frontiers. Meanwhile, the empire's finances grew strained, making it harder to pay soldiers, harder to maintain defenses. Political leaders squabbled among themselves, just when unity was most needed. History loves its what-if moments, those delicate hinges upon which enormous doors swing. What if certain battles had gone differently? What if key leaders had lived longer, made different choices? Emperor Valens rushing into battle without waiting for backup. Stilicho, a capable general, executed at the worst possible moment. A massive naval expedition failing to reclaim lost territories. Each of these moments could have changed everything. The fascinating thing is how life continued, even as empires shifted. People still woke up each morning, still tended their gardens, still told stories to their children. In Ravenna, craftsmen created beautiful mosaics, their hands guided by techniques passed down through generations. Yet their subjects reflected new beliefs, new patrons, new ways of seeing the world. These mosaics tell us something profound about change. Roman artistic methods didn't disappear when Germanic kings took power. Christian themes didn't erase classical beauty. Instead, all these elements blended together, creating something that was both familiar and entirely new. Buildings from this era show us the same pattern. Some were Roman structures, converted for new purposes. Others were built fresh, but incorporated Roman architectural elements. It's like watching a conversation between past and present, each generation adding its voice to an ongoing dialogue. The word barbarian makes us think of chaos, of destruction. But the reality was far more interesting. These Germanic peoples weren't interested in destroying Roman civilization. They wanted to claim it, to become part of it, to make it their own. They saw value in Roman laws, Roman customs, Roman ways of life. What emerged wasn't the end of Rome, but rather Rome's next chapter. Medieval European civilization grew from these roots, carrying forward legal traditions, administrative practices, artistic techniques, philosophical ideas. The flame wasn't extinguished. It was passed from hand to hand, each bearer adding their own fuel to keep it burning. This tells us something important about how civilizations really work. They're not brittle things that shatter completely when struck. They're more like water, taking the shape of whatever container holds them, but never losing their essential nature. Roman influence flowed into new channels, adapted to new circumstances, found new expressions. Perhaps this is Rome's greatest achievement. Not the conquest of territories, not the building of roads or aqueducts, but the creation of a cultural framework so flexible, so adaptable, that it could survive the collapse of the political structure that created it. From Britain to Mesopotamia, people found ways to incorporate Roman ideas into their own societies. The template was strong enough to endure, yet supple enough to change. It offered structure without rigidity, tradition without stagnation. This is why we can still see Roman influence today, in our laws, our languages, our very ideas about government and citizenship. When we study this transformation, we're really studying ourselves. We're all part of civilizations that seem permanent but are constantly changing. We preserve what we value while adapting to new realities. We face uncertainty just as those ancient peoples did. We navigate change just as they did. The gradual nature of historical change means that people living through it rarely see the big picture. Each day feels much like the last. Each small adaptation seems insignificant. Yet, over decades and centuries, these tiny adjustments accumulate into revolutionary transformations. Think of those Romans and their neighbors not as distant historical figures, but as people facing very human challenges. They worried about their families, their futures, their communities. They made decisions based on incomplete information. They hoped for the best while preparing for difficulties. Their world became our world through countless small transitions. A law adapted here, a custom modified there, a tradition passed down but slightly changed with each telling. Revolution disguised as evolution, transformation masquerading as continuity. Future generations might look back on our time with similar curiosity. They might wonder how our civilization changed, what elements persisted, what new forms emerged from the marriage of old and new. They might see patterns that are invisible to us, living as we do in the middle of our own story. This is the wisdom that history offers. The past is never entirely gone, the present is always becoming past, and the future grows from seeds planted long ago. We are all part of an unfolding story, one where endings are really beginnings, where fall becomes transformation, where what seems like decline might actually be renewal in disguise.